Before we get into today's show, I just want to add a quick reminder that any donations given to our nonprofit, Better Burma, will be shared directly with those in Myanmar who need it most. Any and all donations will make such a difference right now. Go to insightmyanmar.org/donation if you would like to contribute, or stay tuned to the end of the episode and hear more options. With that, let's get into the show. I'm excited for this episode to welcome Whit Hornsberger. He is a yoga and meditation teacher. Having spent extended periods at the Mahasi Center in Yangon before the coup, Whit also has a connection to Myanmar that we'll get into later in the talk. But we'll be diving into the trajectory of his personal growth from practitioner to teacher, and also go on to explore how he sees the intersection between the inner journey with social engagement. So, Whit, thanks so much for taking the time to finally connect and have you on here. It's really an honor.
Thank you, Joe. It's very nice to be here.
So let's start off with your story. Long before the spiritual path, I understand that your first real passion was the game of basketball. So can you share with us what drew you to the sport and why you developed such a passion for it, and what aspects of basketball at that time in your youth really resonated with you at a deeper level?
Yeah, well, going back quite a while now, from a young age, I was drawn to sport and the gift of living in a human body. And I was also very drawn to science. And so I grew up really interested in the truth of nature, in science, and as well sport. And I was fortunate enough to be able to pursue basketball. That's what I focused on specifically to quite a high level. And I was able to receive an athletic scholarship to go to university. And, in recent years, I've started to realize as a result of my meditation practice why I was so drawn to sport.
Hmm.
It really had nothing to do with the winning, the championships, whatever it may be. Although at the time I figured that's what it was about.
Mm-hmm.
What I now realize is, as I'm sure you're well aware, when an athlete is in the zone, it is a transcendental state, the state of anatta. And so I didn't realize it at that time, but now I realize that was the big thing that kept me going back to sport, was just that experience of being in complete flow and liberation. And that's what I got out of basketball.
That's cool. So, yeah, you referenced getting a scholarship. You went to the University of Calgary, I understand, the Dinos, but
Mhm.
you blew out your ACL. And then reflecting back on it later, you wrote, quote, "The subsequent emotional and mental suffering inherent in losing one's supposed self-identity and self-worth. As I
Mhm.
began to inquire into the healing of my physical body, and as I pulled back the layers, it became obvious that other dimensions of my being were in dire need of attention and love. The healing of my mind, body, and heart began. And this is where, and from there, I have never looked back," end quote. So tell us more about how devastated you were when you had this basketball career ending injury, and then how unexpectedly it became an opening for this deeper exploration.
Yeah, I mean, as I mentioned, from the time I was very young, I was involved in sport. As my mom tells the story, I went from crawling straight to running. There was no
Mm,
walking phase, and
mhm,
so from a very young age, growing up, the ego instinct was conditioned to become the character of self and personified as an athlete.
mm,
And so as I grew older, and that character, that persona became more and more developed within the mind. Without any judgment towards myself at the time, I just became very readily identified with that. And my whole life, from the time I was a young child, I just wanted to be a professional athlete, and
mm,
I put in, an intense and extreme amount of time and effort into my athletics. And then, with, I guess I was in my last year of university basketball, and I had a couple contracts to go play professional basketball in Europe.
mhm,
And at the start of the preseason camp, we had a new shoe deal and put on a new pair of shoes. And they were so grippy that when I went to do a pivot move, that was a basic basketball move, instead of the foot pivoting on the hardwood, the shoe stuck because it was so grippy. And that rotation went up through my knee joint. And
mhm,
yeah, knee joints aren't supposed to rotate like that. And then I
mhm,
blew my ACL. So, it was a pretty hard fallout for me. I was misdiagnosed for quite a while. I wound up playing on it for a couple months before realizing what was actually going on. And so it was a little bit bittersweet, when I finally received the proper diagnosis that, in the words of the surgeon at the university, he told me I had completely shredded my ACL. It would have probably been a partial tear when it happened, but then I kept playing on it. So it was devastating, for myself. I'm not of huge stature. I'm about 6'1". So my advantage in sport and basketball was quickness and agility. And although I could have, it's possible to come back from that injury and continue. At that point in my life, I had played through so many injuries, so many broken bones, that I just felt it was time to step away from the game that I loved and to explore other dimensions of life outside of competitive sport. And so from there, I started to. Yeah, I was fortunate at the time. I was introduced to yoga by a female friend at university, and at that time, athletic teams weren't using yoga like they are now, and it was kind of a foreign thing, especially for male athletes. And I didn't get into yoga in terms of what we typically see in Western society, like the postures, done in a yoga studio. For me, my introduction to yoga was really one of yoga therapy and yoga rehab, and it was about developing a sense of self inquiry through kind of cultivating and awakening witness consciousness, the refuge of awareness. And as I did that and developed this ability, what we would now call mindfulness, that detached receptivity to observe the sensations in my body, I certainly began to realize, there were other aspects of my embodiment that I had, largely ignored throughout my life, especially the emotional body and the heart. At that time when I grew up in the 80s and 90s playing sport, and I think still now. And I also grew up playing, American style football in Canada, and the common saying, "Big boys don't cry." So it was a lot of emotion and pain, both physical and mental, that had been pushed down, that I didn't even know was there, and it became evident to me as I continued to do my healing on the physical body that the mental body also had a large amount of healing that needed to be attended to, and that's what kind of got me onto the path that I've now found myself upon for the past, I don't know, 18 years, I guess.
mhm. That's quite a lot of introspection and vulnerability and insight into the personal being coming from a place of, as you describe it, just the sport culture, macho male sport culture. And
Hmm.
especially at a time, I mean, now there's a lot more awareness about yoga and mindfulness and even mental illness and other things. And even in professional sports, you see that. But back then, very little of that. And you're coming from that culture and that conditioning. So as you went on this inner journey of first yoga and then meditation, but all kind of coming from this place of mindfulness and understanding the body and mind relationship, did you have any background in, in like therapy or anything of that nature, which would make you predisposed to being able to open up in this way to these really kind of earth shattering realizations that can come in this moment? Or was this really just did this really come with a force of something wholly unknown and new to have to delve into?
Yeah, great question. I mean, I think it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly, but I think, as I mentioned, the time I was a young boy, I was also very interested in science, uh, questioning, the way things were in the world around me. So there was always kind of an introspective uh, aspect to the personality that we call wit. And I was basically doing exactly what not to do to heal, and what I
Hmm.
found my mind was doing was the classic aversion to discomfort and the pushing away, and so I literally was trying to run away from my physical and mental suffering. And now that sport was over, I always had wanted to travel, and I had met a couple Australian friends here on Vancouver Island surfing. And as part of the Commonwealth, they're like, well, why don't you come to Australia to work and surf for a year? So I did. And I went there, and it was a transformative year of my life because I didn't clearly see that I was suffering, but I was, filling my life with all sorts of pleasurable distractions, partying. As much as I love surfing, I was using that to spiritually bypass what needed to be looked at. And I was getting into yoga, more and more into yoga at the time, starting to read, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. And I was introduced to Buddhism at the time as well in Australia. And I came across a book that was, I guess I would say kind of the first book I really got onto or into with regard to the teachings of the Buddha. And it was by the Dalai Lama. And the title was The Art of Happiness. And in that moment, which was a moment of pain and suffering that I was in when I came across that book, there was like a flash of witness consciousness in my mind. And almost, if I recall correctly, I kind of laughed to myself, and I
Hmm.
realized in that moment, and I acknowledged to myself, I was certainly not happy. And if
Hmm.
this was an art that is happiness, I wanted to pursue it with as much intention as I did basketball and everything else that I've pursued in my life. So that's kind of what got me going.
And so then how big a gap was there between your first experience of yoga, which was kind of this introduction of some kind of mindfulness and within the body and looking at the pain suppression and ego and everything else, and when you then went to Australia, started surfing and read this book by the Dalai Lama, and really from that book, from that line, decided to invest yourself with a full commitment to that path? What time frame are you talking about between that first introduction and the deeper dive?
Hmm. Yeah, well, I guess I tore my ACL at the end of 2004, had surgery at the start of 2005, and by 2007, I was living in Australia. In that window between '05 and '07,
Mhm.
I was definitely uh, continuing to. The way I refer to it is we're not awakening these things unless we're reawakening them. So at
Mhm.
that time through my rehab, it was a very tedious process because with the graft that they use to reconstruct my ACL, you have to do enough slight, very subtle movement each day. So the graft doesn't become scar tissue and they have to redo it. But if you do
Mhm.
too much, you can tear the graft and then they also have to redo it. So it was a very, very tedious, painstaking process. But I think over the years of playing sport, I've had students ask me, did I do a degree or diploma in anatomy? And
Mhm.
I kind of laugh. And the truth is, I didn't. I just spent an incredible amount of time in physiotherapy rooms and dealing with doctors and team trainers because of the injuries. So I think just from being an athlete and a very dedicated one, there was already a deep connection between awareness and the language of sensation in the body.
Mhm.
And then that continued to evolve as I got more and more into, a yogic perspective, witness consciousness, and listening to the wisdom of the body. And then that kind of just snowballed as these books kind of came into my life. And,
Mhm.
the one central teaching of that book that I remember I tell this story often when I teach retreats, that I opened this book. I was reading this book by the Dalai Lama, and it was almost like these children's books. I don't know if they still have them. They had them around in the 80s and 90s, of course. They opened, and a cardboard kind of castle would come up and
Mm-hmm.
pop out.
Mm-hmm.
And it was almost like the Dalai Lama popped out in cardboard form, and he said, "Whit, if you ever want to be truly happy, you have to be able to discern the difference between pleasure and happiness."
Mm-hmm.
And in that moment, it really struck me that everything I was doing in my life was about pleasure, and it was about masking both the physical and the mental emotional pain. And that really kind of fueled me to understand more about what was going on.
That's really interesting. I really enjoy just hearing and appreciating the different stations and contours of the spiritual journey that our guests go on. There are guests I speak to that just have this really soft, gradual awakening of they've become vegan, and then they've started looking at different therapy or working in some kind of organic gardening, and then the meditation comes and it just kind of flows in this easy, relaxed way. And then there's the more of the jagged back and forth, which definitely is more my journey
Mhm.
of having some intense meditative experiences, but still not really ready or knowing how to give up other aspects of the life that I was leading at the time. And this or perhaps people also can speak of well, these four precepts I really saw the point of, but this one I just wanted a couple more years. And usually that one
Mhm.
either is
Mhm.
something to do with intoxication or something to do
Mhm.
with sexuality. Those are the ones that really that people have a hard time giving up that last one, especially Westerners. And then of course when you're talking to Burmese, you're looking at a whole different cultural dynamic of the
Right.
time that they might have spent as political prisoners or in the democracy movement, or their relationship between traditional forms of Buddhism and the more impactful direct experiences of awakening and feeling their own agency. So it's interesting to
Mhm.
hear with that context in mind. It's interesting to then reflect on this 2 year period you talk about, where the yoga is at first introducing new ways of looking at things through a mindful way, which through your background and as an athlete of knowing your body and sensations you have, but it's opening up new doorways. Surfing is playing a role, being in touch with nature and enjoying that. And yet also up until that Dalai Lama line, realizing that your part of you at least is still moving in some direction of pleasure over happiness. And there's some elements you're not quite ready to give up to go deeper into that path. Is that a correct way of understanding it?
Yeah, that's absolutely it. I recall too, years after a couple years after I got back from Australia, I guess in '09, maybe 10, when I went on my first vipassana retreat, actually with the Spirit Rock crew, Jack Kornfield and the like, down in Joshua Tree, California. And I remember, hearing a talk about dukkha, suffering. And I remember sitting there, and there was this voice of the self and the ego instinct inside my head, and thinking, like, what's wrong with all these people around me? Why are they suffering so much? Still, even at
Mm-hmm.
that point, uh, blind and misperceiving what suffering actually was. And so it was, this gradual kind of systematic unraveling of misperception, and as the Buddha referred to it, the removal of dust from the eye of the mind. So it wasn't like this kind of black and white. All of a sudden it was just like a spontaneous moment of like seeing clearly. It was like,
Mm-hmm.
the mind had been so conditioned in one way. And as the quote that you shared, it was like, it, at that time I thought I had lost my identity. I had no
Mm-hmm.
idea who I was or what my
Mm-hmm.
worth was anymore. And that really drove me into, a very dark place in my mind, and a sense of unworthiness, and really a very dangerous place in my mind. And I really feel that the teachings of the Buddha and yoga as well, saved my life, literally and figuratively speaking. So
So you're talking about the loss of identity, meaning that you can no longer practice sport.
yeah, exactly. I guess just my whole life, the construct of self. was based upon what I could do athletically. I went to school, had that paid for because I could dribble a ball between my legs
Mm-hmm.
and shoot a 3-point shot. And so this construct of self, we often think is just something that's created within our own minds, but of course it's a patchwork quilt of everyone and everything that's around us. And so when I was involved in sport my whole life, I kind of think of it like I was literally raised in a locker room,
Mm-hmm.
around teammates and coaches, and it was an amazing experience.
Mm-hmm.
But when that all ended very abruptly, I really had no idea who or what I was. And as that kind of, carpet was pulled out from underneath me, it felt very, unstable and scary. And it was from there that, I remember with the Yoga Sutras, when I first picked up a copy of that. And I remember one of the things that, it referred to was like, it was saying, who you think you are is not who you actually are.
Mm-hmm.
And having a scientific, inspired type mind from the time I was a child, that really got me super interested,
Mm-hmm.
which was, fascinating for me because, when I was an athlete, our coach, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, at that time, athletes weren't using yoga.
Mm-hmm.
And if you went to a yoga studio, it was all female teachers and female practitioners for the most part.
Mm-hmm.
And so before my injury, we had a yoga teacher come in, and my coach brought her in, and we did a session. And he asked me after, I was the captain of the team at the time, and he said, what do you think? Should we continue with this? And I ignorantly responded to him. And as I share this with my students. I said, with all due respect, coach, yoga is for girls. And then I walked back to the weight room and continued with
Mm-hmm.
the macho type A driven work ethic that can be helpful. But
Yeah.
when it goes to an extreme, as it often does in sport and in Western contemporary society, basically what happened was I was carrying too much strength and muscle for my frame. And so,
Wow.
I say it was the shoe gripped. That was part of it, but it was because there was too much torque in the muscles of my legs for the frame
Mm-hmm.
of my skeleton, and my ligament just wasn't designed to hold that much strength. And so, the irony that now I'm doing what I'm doing is very humbling, to say the least.
That's an amazing story. That's great. I want to get on to talk about this burgeoning spiritual path that you took on and those insights. Before we do, I just want to tie a bow and the basketball thing. Being myself,
Mm.
being also a former basketball player and fan, although nowhere near your level. Just something I was always a love of mine and something I've had a relationship with as I've come back to as well. So just looking back on how you look at basketball now, I'm curious, do you still watch basketball? Do you ever play pickup games? And if so, what's your relationship to it? How do you feel about it now that you've come back after such a journey from what you were before?
Hmm. Well, very cool. I didn't know that about you, Joe. That's
Hmm.
awesome. We'll have to get together and get some shots up at some point.
Sure.
Um, yeah, now I'm still interested in what I'm interested in is human performance, whether that's physical and or mental, and which of course it's both. You can't have one without the other. So, to me, I have no interest in who wins or loses. People ask me, what's your favorite team? I grew up worshiping Michael Jordan, so it was the Bulls. But I don't follow leagues anymore. But I'm still interested in seeing, the performance of athletes, both in basketball, track and field, football, soccer, whatever it may be. Um, I don't go shoot very often. I had a second knee surgery on the same knee a few years later, so I have no cartilage in that joint. So bouncing around on even a hardwood floor, let alone a concrete slab, is not preferable to my knee joint. But I still love it, and it was an incredible journey. I had so much joy from it, made so many great friendships, of course, over the years. And, really it's amazing to me how much it crosses over into meditation practice. As I mentioned, the transcendental experience. And also for me being of smaller stature, I played point guard. And so, being in that position where you have 9 other guys on the floor, and you're reading, with open awareness what is going on, and it's
Mm-hmm.
it's all uncontrollable.
Mm-hmm.
It's all impermanent, changing at very rapid speed. what I've realized is that development of my brain through the awareness of being a point guard and having to read plays like that has been, very helpful and supportive in vipassana, where you're also developing kind of that detached awareness of seeing how these things operate, how they're interconnected, where they're coming from, and where they're going.
So you must love guys like Jokic now, right?
Oh yeah, it's so good to see that.
So how about when you watch basketball now, when you're watching as a viewer, and I understand you're not watching for teams or
Mhm,
or those kind of victories or legacies, but more
mhm,
individual performance, but you're also watching with awareness of the mind and body rather than just, oh God, I hope this team wins or I hope that loses. Or maybe that is something animating, but then there's another part of the mind that's like, oh,
mm.
look at this attachment. Isn't this interesting? Because meditation is not a journey of trying to prevent or control those reactions, but rather to understand and to observe them. And so those reactions can still come and we could just have awareness. But as you're watching a basketball game, do you notice anything inside your mind about the way that you're kind of looking at this practice, which was such a important part of your upbringing?
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of the time when I am watching, I'm just thinking I wish I could have a chance to sit down with some of these athletes. And
Mm-hmm.
I have worked with athletic teams in the past. I lived in Vancouver for a few years. I was working with both the UBC, University of British Columbia men's and women's basketball teams. Um, some athletes from those programs have gone on to play pro basketball in Europe, and I've worked a little bit with them. It is something I'd like to get back into at some point, because as I said, to me, as I explain when I teach vipassana, it's all about living efficiently, and sport is also about being the most efficient. And in terms of physical athletic prowess, I'm not going to say we're at the pinnacle because everything's always changing, but the level of athleticism nowadays
Mm-hmm.
is incredible, and
Mm-hmm.
yet I still see that the mind still has so much more that it can attain
Mm-hmm.
for athletes to take them to that next level. And so, I always looked at basketball as a very interesting sport, and talking about this construct of self, and transcending it when you're in flow or you're in the zone. Basketball is a really interesting sport because when you're in the flow of the game and you're in the zone, you're not thinking, I'm Whit, the point guard, this and that, or whatever. You're in
Mm-hmm.
the game. But
Mm-hmm.
then in basketball, of course, you have fouls. And so you get fouled and the game stops. The flow literally stops. And you go to the foul line. And now all of a sudden the construct of self starts to come
Mm-hmm.
online, and it starts to remember, was it the last shot, free throw, was it a miss or a make? If you're playing in an opposing gym, the fans are yelling your name, trying to get you to miss. Maybe the announcer is saying, Whit Hornsberger to the line for two. And that's part of that patchwork quilt where all of a sudden, you see athletes could be very good shooters from the field,
Mm-hmm.
but then they get to the foul line and the construct of self comes back
Hmm.
online, and all of a sudden their percentage drops way below what it should be for what is called a free throw. So
Mhm.
I look at that, and as I say to students sometimes, I'm like, imagine if we could get athletes to be able to perform and be constantly in a transcendental state, in flow. And then, as I quickly say, at the end of the day, who really cares about wins or losses? Imagine if we could get humanity to be in a consistent state of flow, transcending the limitations of the conditioned self that gives rise to all this dukkha. So I certainly do look at athletics from a different perspective now.
Mhm. That's awesome. That's so great. I'd love to have you as a color commentary on one of those games to to watch. That'd be awesome.
Thank you.
Um, but let's go into the journey which informed you with this kind of insight and awareness in watching a basketball game or anything else. And you had referenced that I think you said your first meditation experience was Spirit Rock. Can you describe that course and then the subsequent journey that you took after that?
Yeah, so before I went on that retreat, I was doing a lot of study and home practice, and going to yoga classes and getting introduced to Buddhist mindfulness. Um, but that was my first formal meditation retreat. And yeah, down in Joshua Tree, it was an amazing experience. Pretty overwhelming. I can't recall for certain, but there must have been, I think, 150 or more practitioners there. And one thing I do recall when I was there is having, the demographic was, I will say, my body's turning 41 next month, so it was kind of a little bit older than that, like 45, 50 and up. And I remember those individuals, a lot of them, before we went into silence, saying to me, they're just looking at me. I guess I would have been like 26, 27 at the time, just saying, I wish I would have found this stuff at that age. And so I went into that retreat. And as I said, previously, I didn't even really realize how much I was suffering. I didn't really understand truly what dukkha is. It's dukkha, suffering. It's something, I think, to the Western mind, the connotation of suffering is this extreme experience, which it can be, certainly, or it can arise from an extreme life experience. But, it's also these very mundane, trivial, day-to-day moments that we have of dissatisfaction and discontent. And, as I say to practitioners, do as I say, not as I do. I learned a lot from doing things I probably shouldn't have been doing. With the injuries I had coming from sport into meditation, there was absolutely no reason I should have been sitting on the floor trying to sit cross-legged during that retreat. But the ego was still in control, and I didn't want to be the young one sitting on the chair, and I sat through an incredible amount of physical pain in that experience. But I learned a lot from it. I began to see the difference between, pain in the body and suffering in the mind. And I remember one experience on that retreat specifically where Jack Kornfield was leading the sit, and I was sitting there, and there was so much physical discomfort and aversion towards it that mind and body was so tense that there was sweat dripping down my back. And at that time, my mind couldn't discern the difference, really. I just felt that all that pain was in the physical body. And then, without maybe even being too aware of it, there was so much, tanha, like wanting for Jack to ring the bell. And then at the moment he rang the Tibetan bell to end the sit, there was this flood of release of tension within the body. And I remember sitting there and having this aha moment where there was still some physical discomfort. I'm not saying by any means that the mind just makes up physical pain. There was physical discomfort, no question. But when the mind got what it wanted, and that is the ringing of the bell, tanha had been satiated. So there was no more craving, no more wanting. And all of a sudden, that tension released from the body. And I sat there thinking to myself, you know what? I could have kept sitting for longer. It wasn't the physical body, it was the mind. And
Hmm.
that was one of the major insights I took from that experience, that what often appears to be all physical pain is invariably physical pain, yes, corroborated exponentially and compounded exponentially by mental aversion and tension and resistance.
Right. That's a great summary and encapsulation of really profound insight from a first meditation course. And so then where did that take you? You're continuing on your trajectory of having started with yoga and then having this line from the Dalai Lama really speak out to you, having a really excruciating but powerful course with these insights that you take away. What was next for your meditation journey after that?
Yeah, so I started I dove headfirst into the healing journey, and I wound up starting a course of Chinese medicine here at a holistic school in Victoria on Vancouver Island. And, it was a 5-year course. I had done an undergrad degree. I'd gone traveling in between, so I kind of had the travel bug. And about 6 months into that course, they announced a diploma of yoga therapy, and that resonated with me a lot. And the fact that it was a year-long course, and so I changed faculties, and I did this diploma of yoga therapy, which really was my first introduction to yogic education. So it was, not yoga as workout; it was yoga as therapy, both for body and mind. And then from there, I wanted to continue to pursue surfing, and I caught wind of a school of yoga down in Costa Rica, which is no longer there, led by two teachers who were formerly living in an ashram, and for almost 20 years, and they had gotten married and moved down there, and so I went down there and I spent
Mhm.
6 months studying yoga with them. And that was an incredible experience, really, just for my own understanding. It was a teacher training, but I was petrified of public speaking. And when I was younger, when I was an athlete, when I was in flow on the court, the mind was confident. But once that flow was over, speaking to reporters after the game or interviews, it really wasn't my thing. So I never intended on teaching. And so I went and did that training. And then from there, my body was still such a wreck that I couldn't really do any other type of work. I couldn't do physical labor. I couldn't sit down in a chair at a desk. I couldn't stand up for very long periods. So as I mentioned previously, when I was getting into these things, the yoga studios were predominantly, if not completely, female yoga teachers. And so I had this new teacher training degree, if you want to call it that. And I went, door to door to these yoga studios, and I wouldn't even finish the opening sentence. After they heard that I had done a teacher training, they wanted me to come teach because they just wanted to have some male teachers on the teaching roster.
Mhm.
So that opened a lot of doors, literally and figuratively speaking. And then from there, I got more into mindfulness practice, started going to retreats down at Land of Medicine Buddha near Santa Cruz, and combined that with a surf trip up in Washington State at Cloud Mountain. And then close to Vancouver Island, here in between Vancouver Island and the mainland, what was formerly known as the Buddhist Hermitage. I was going up there and doing retreats, minimum once a year. Sometimes I was doing two, sometimes three a year. And so, as my personality has always been, if I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it, with all my energy, or I don't do it at all. I see it as a waste of time. So I really went in with spiritual urgency, samvega, and that kind of just led one thing to another. And teaching yoga allowed me to make not much money whatsoever
Mhm.
at that time, but it allowed me to keep my body moving as I made a little bit of money. And so that just kept going, and that now it's going on like 13, 14 years of teaching. I would have never guessed that's where I would be. So
So as you started to go deeper into this meditation practice, and I also want to mention the yoga journey, kind of trying to figure out whether it's easier to talk about it sequentially and chronologically, or look at mapping out these different journeys in these respective fields, and then looking later where they come back together. And I think that might make more sense. But so just for the moment, just looking at the more meditation part of it and the practice that you were doing. I understand your first course was with Jack Kornfield and Spirit Rock.
mhm.
There are so many different forms of meditation out there and so many different types of teachings and emphases. How did you decide on what style or practice or teaching or lineage you wanted to start to go into and learn?
Yeah, it's funny to me now because amongst other forms of ignorance and misperception of my mind on that first retreat, I didn't even realize at the time that what Jack was instructing, and through books I was reading of his, um, that I was learning the Mahasi method. And so, at that time, it was that was my first Vipassana retreat. But then I recall actually coming back, and that summer I started to hear, a lot of people talking about Vipassana, and it was like this trendy thing. And, for better or for worse, I was always one that was skeptical of trends. And with ignorance, I just decided, I was like, you know what? I'm going to focus on samatha like practices. And so I really started to dive into calm abiding meditation, and then I was introduced. I came across two teachers, Kitasaro and Tanisara. Kitasaro from Tennessee originally. Tanisara, she is from the UK, and they met through
Hmm.
the lineage of Ajahn Chah.
Hmm.
Kitasaro spent many years in the Thai forest tradition. First went to Oxford on a scholarship, and then met Ajahn Chah in the UK in the 70s, and saw the truth of Dhamma and dropped out.
Hmm.
And so, you know, when I look back on it, Joa, I don't remember any conscious decision to choose a lineage.
Hmm.
I think at that time too, I wasn't ignorant to the fact that there were different lineages. I think at the time there was just no clarity to me about what the differences were,
Hmm.
from Theravadan to Tibetan to Mahayana, whatever it may be. And these were just the teachers that kind of came into my life, or I came to theirs, or a little bit of both. And then it just went from there. That's just what I was exposed to at the time. I didn't even know about Goenka Vipassana.
Hmm.
It's just kind of how it flowed. And from there, then I spent my time really focusing in the Mahasi tradition, and the tradition of Ajahn Chah, and then combined with some intellectual teachings and wisdom from the Thai forest tradition of Ajahn Buddhadasa.
Right. And all of these different teachings and lineages kind of have their own emphases and protocols and everything. When I think of Mahasi, I think of much more of a technique style and obviously Abhidhamma background and
Mm,
possibly, depending on how it's disseminated, Burmese cultural aspects in there as well. When I think of Thai forest tradition and Ajahn Chah and such, I think less of a technique and more, I mean, because in the Thai forest tradition, so much of their living and their spiritual growth and their understanding of Dhamma was through nature, was through the experience of
mhm,
confronting nature, sometimes in, really hardcore and crazy and intense ways. When you read about some of those stories of the old Thai forest masters, taken I've never been to a Thai forest center outside of Thailand. I did go to some in Thailand, but those were much more in the Thai way of not really technique based, but more on having nature inform you and kind of being around the wisdom of these great masters who might try to their tutoring style in the monastery was more focused on imparting certain lessons through the structure of who they were tutoring, that they might be tutoring for years and years and years, these novice monks that would come, often Westerners, rather than say a Mahasi or Goenka style where you
mhm,
just get a flat technique for a certain period of time, and that technique is then the teacher will then try to show and prove how the format of this technique and the technical matters of the teaching of it align with different parts of the suttas and such. And so
mhm.
as you were combining this own spiritual path that you had, I wonder, like, to what degree were you encompassing different techniques? To what degree were you kind of resting on one technique, but then hearing wise and inspiring words from someone else that would more orient you to the core technique you were practicing? Or how would you describe that?
Yeah, well put, Joa. Yeah, I think for me, what was, among other things, so helpful with the fallout of the basketball injury, was that I learned a hard lesson of identifying with, one path. I identified with, I was an athlete, and not realizing that that was anicca, an impermanent state. It caused me, or that relationship or that identification, that attachment caused extreme suffering in my life. So when I started to get into the teachings of the Buddha and yoga as well, I didn't even necessarily need any willpower to do it. It was just kind of very natural for me to not become identified as a Buddhist meditator, or identified as a meditator of this lineage and not that lineage. And so for the first like 5, maybe 6 years of my path of meditation, I really um, kind of experienced different teachers, all with a common ground, of course, not only the common ground of the Buddha Dhamma, but of Theravada Buddhism. Um, and as a result of that, like as you alluded to, I gained great benefit because the Mahasi method is very, very specific, to the point, of a rigorous scientific investigation, which I love. And then I had that kind of almost, if you will, like yang like approach to training the mind, combined with kind of a more yin, laid back approach of Ajahn Chah, who was, by all accounts, quite a character, quite a humorous fellow. And as you mentioned, in the Thai forest traditions, they used a lot of the natural teachings of the environment around them, the Dhamma of nature itself, to give rise to insight. And so for me, that really resonated deeply, aside from sport and science, growing up in Canada, our family, we grew up, camping all the time and spending lots of time in nature. So there was this really nice balance of it. And I didn't feel at that time any pressure from teachers or any need to say, okay, this is 100% the path that I'm going on.
Hmm.
And then I did, eventually once I went to Myanmar for the first time and the Mahasi Center there, that's when I really started to go deeper and deeper onto that path because I had spent an extensive period of time there. I really saw results from that experience. And yet still to this day, in my own practice, I still incorporate a lot of the wisdom and understanding of Ajahn Chah, Ajahn Buddhadasa, and not to the point where I feel like it's hindering my progress,
Hmm.
uh, but where it's supporting it. And yeah, so that's kind of what's led me to where I am right now in my practice.
So is it fair to say that you're you're more of a Mahasi practitioner of the technique with the inspiration and the guidance and the examples of life from the Thai forest tradition? Would that be a fair statement of your practice?
Yeah, I think that would be quite bang on, actually. I've and nothing against the methods of Ajahn Chah.
Hmm.
From what I've experienced, the Ajahn Chah method, if you can call it that,
Hmm.
is more of this open refuge of awareness.
Hmm.
And having said that, the Mahasi method, at a certain point, as I often say to students, and I don't encourage it because the mind often wants to take the training wheels off before it's ready. But eventually, the noting of the Mahasi method, the mental noting, that tool, like training wheels, is, I won't say disposed of completely, but
Hmm.
is not necessarily needed at all times. And then at sometimes when the mind is lacking energy and or focus,
Hmm.
that noting practice is very helpful to lift the mind's attention up. But at the end of the
Right.
day, that refuge of awareness that Ajahn Chah is talking about and that Mahasi is using the noting to get to is the same refuge of awareness.
I haven't ever practiced Mahasi per se, but from what
Mm-hmm.
I've read and other practitioners I've talked to, I think it's a bit of an unfair criticism they've received from those that try to describe why the Mahasi technique is perhaps not the best vehicle is the noting and describing that you can never really get to a depth of the mind beyond this. And any serious Mahasi practitioner I've talked to has said some version of what you mentioned. And one of the first interviews we ever did at Insight Myanmar was with Alan Clements, who was an American monk during the 1980s and beyond in Burma. So at a time when it was quite closed, and he was one of the only ones there. And he talked about how with Mahasi as well as U Pandita, he saw hundreds of different question and answers with all kinds of practitioners. And he went on to say, and this has become somewhat of a controversial statement. Others have refuted that the way he put it, but just to kind of give an example of how it could be described, he said there's no such thing as a Mahasi technique. He said that it was there was so many different variations based on interactions with students and the profound wisdom that the teacher had that this culmination of advice ended up going into understand, as it got exported and others carried it in different ways, it got exported into a basic structure and vehicle of teachings which could be delivered and then called Mahasi. But for people like Alan Clements that were up close and personal, they saw it as much more wide ranging. And that's very different from the Goenka story, where Goenka is very much delivering a set technique, and not only delivering that technique, but supposing that this technique, even though this isn't true, as people have found out, have since come to learn, this technique is the exact technique that the lineage he's claiming has also been practicing in previous generations. And so the
Mm-hmm.
that emphasis and identification on not just the technique but the value of the technique and the lineages before that carried it, that's different from what has come to be known as the Mahasi technique. But then that's different altogether from like Mahasi and Goenka kind of on one part of it, then looking at something like Ajahn Chah, or who I have practiced with, Sayadaw U Tejaniya in
Mm-hmm.
Burma, that also promotes an open kind of awareness, where when if you were to look at Ajahn Chah or U Tejaniya and be asked the question, well, what is the technique, from a, say, Mahasi or Goenka meditator, or what is the technique that's actually being taught here? One is kind of hard pressed to come up with it. I mean, certainly you can with Ajahn Chah, you can go to the Budo of breath, or with
Mhm.
Utejaniya, you can quote some preliminary basic instructions, but beyond that, there's really nothing like you find in some of the course retreat methods of a Goenka or a Mahasi lineage practitioner.
Yeah, I agree with what you're saying, and yeah, it's interesting because Alan Clements actually years ago when I was living in Vancouver, he became a yoga student of mine. I mean, I had
Hmm,
no idea who he was. He
hmm.
was always up in the front row, and that's how I was first introduced to the Mahasi Meditation Center
Oh,
in Myanmar.
wow.
So that's where I have a connection with Alan. He invited me to go there for the first time. That's how I was introduced to the Mahasi method. Not the Mahasi method, I shouldn't say that, but the Mahasi monastery in Yangon. So, based upon what he said, I don't think I'm really in the position to be able to comment on that. But whether there's actually a method or not, whatever it is. But I think at the end of the day, at least from what I have gleaned from different traditions and different teachers, these methods and these lineages are bringing us to that same refuge
Hmm.
of detached receptivity where we can see things as they are. And I think with the Mahasi method too, um, and with any method, I think, as the Buddha said in his first ever sermon, patient endurance is the supreme practice for freeing the heart from unwholesome states. And I think um, the Mahasi method can be difficult for practitioners at first because uh, practitioners, we want to be in kind of this like flow state and feel good, and
Hmm.
and when you bring in mental noting at first, if we're not used to doing it, it
Hmm.
takes a lot of mental energy. It's
Right.
tiring. It can actually give rise to more thinking.
Hmm.
um, and I wouldn't say that any method is the right method for everyone, but what I began to find with the Mahasi method that I found really helpful was um, using the mental noting. It allowed me to use that noting in the mind as a barometer to see if I was actually noting with true mindfulness. And what I mean by that is, mindfulness being a complete detached uh, awareness of momentary experience. Um, it it's very difficult when there's any unpleasant phenomena, whether it's physical and or mental, coming up in the mind, for a mind that hasn't been trained for many years to just to note unpleasant with complete equanimity.
Hmm.
And so for many years I thought that I was noting with mindfulness. But as I share with students, just as when we speak to each other as human beings, I might say something to you, Joa, and not realize that there's a tone in the way I say it. And
Hmm.
then the way you receive it completely changes the meaning of what thought I was trying to say to you.
Hmm.
And similarly, what I found very helpful with the Mahasi method was I began to realize that even though I thought the mind was noting with true sati, true mindfulness, in other words, imbued with metta, loving kindness, what I began to realize is that, tanha and upadana, craving and attachment, is extremely subtle. And so it takes time, for whether using a noting method or not, for the mind to be able to truly receive unpleasant experiences that for time immemorial it's been pushing away from with complete equanimity. And when I finally had this aha moment where I realized I was noting, but it wasn't it wasn't true loving awareness, that there was these traces of tanha, that allowed me to use the noting practice as this barometer where I began to see, okay, there's still attachment in that noting, even though it
Hmm.
sounds in my mind that there's not. I could look closer and closer and begin to see, okay, this is not true mindfulness yet. It's presence. I'm present with what's arising, but the mind isn't completely accepting with metta what is arising. And that's what I found very, very helpful to me, using that noting practice as a barometer in terms of the tone that the noting mind may be using.
Right. So let's go a bit deeper into that Mahasi practice and from where it originated. You mentioned how you were propelled to go to Burma to practice there. Can you talk about what led to that decision and then describe that experience? And you referenced how impactful it was. Talk a bit about what was so profound about that experience, especially after you'd already been on this path for some time and taking a number of courses over on this side of the ocean, how going over there really made a big difference from what you'd been doing over here in North America.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was certainly life changing. And, as I mentioned, Alan invited me to go at that time. He took a couple groups. He was doing, I can't remember if they were two-week retreats
Hmm.
with a week off in between. And I wound up going, we agreed together, wound up going for the entire time. So this was my first time in an Asian monastery. And I think it was like 47 or 48 days in the Mahasi Center. And certainly it was a very, very challenging experience. The expectations of the wanting mind, I remember thinking like, oh yeah, I'm going to Southeast Asia to a Buddhist monastery. This is going to be very serene and quiet, not realizing that it's in the middle of Yangon and that,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know, I don't know about all Buddhist monasteries, but the Mahasi monastery, it's like a little town, so
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
have vehicles driving around, you have
Yeah.
people doing construction with power tools. And I remember going there and just the sounds were overwhelming. And then of course, the ego instinct is playing the story like, how much will it cost to change my flight to go home? How could these people be so disrespectful? I've come all the way from Vancouver to work on my spirituality, the whole narrative of the
Hmm.
wanting mind. Um, so it took some time, and that schedule from 3 a.m. to 11 p.m., 2 meals a day, 5 a.m. breakfast, 10 a.m. lunch, and the Mahasi style of moving incredibly slowly throughout every movement of the day was obviously challenging, but it really gave me the chance to go deeply into the practice, and also to really see, as challenging as the conditions were, that conditions aren't the source of my suffering. As much as the mind was pointing the finger outwardly,
Hmm.
I had, at that time, I think there was 400, 500 monastics, uh, monks and nuns and lay people. And so I couldn't hide from the fact that when I was suffering and I looked at, these monks and nuns with a smile on their face doing the same work,
Hmm.
that I had to acknowledge that, okay, the suffering isn't something outside of me, that the trigger is inside. And so that was a really, profound experience to see, how much wanting there was. It was just
Hmm.
constant wanting. It was hot, 40 degrees,
Hmm.
mosquitoes.
Yeah.
It was a retreat of tanha, which is, as the Buddha said, we suffer because we don't see our suffering, and we suffer because we don't see the cause of our suffering, nothing else. And so that experience was, like a bachelor degree in tanha. And it radically shifted the way I was looking at things, or the mind was looking at things.
Reminds me of that famous story of Ajahn Sumedho, the American disciple of Ajahn
Mhm.
Chah. He's told many times where he was in his young monkhood, he was at Ajahn Chah's forest monastery and just suffering, 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 unhappy with everything. And eventually Ajahn Chah walked over to him and said, this unhappiness you have, is it in the monastery or is it in you? Because if it's in the monastery, it's very easy. You should just go away and then you won't have this unhappiness anymore. But if it's in you, well, then you're kind of in a bit more of a pickle because leaving the monastery isn't really going to do anything. And that was it's kind of like this Zen like moment of a conversation that sparked Ajahn Sumedho's spiritual path in the many decades that would follow that realization that the suffering wasn't him, it wasn't in the monastery, and that
Mhm.
leaving would not do anything for it. And that made him redouble his efforts as a monk and become quite a respected monk today. So the story
Mhm.
reminds me of what you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say that, it reminds me of something I often share with students, that my father, told me from a young age, and still to this day, he says it from time to time. He would say, Whit, be careful when you point the finger at someone else, because if you look closely, there are three fingers pointing back at
Mm,
you. And that's the wanting mind, that it's amazing how obvious it becomes once the refuge of awareness is developed.
mhm,
And it's incredible how blind the conditioned mind is to the constant and at least in my mind at that time in my life, the unceasing wanting of things to be other than they are, or things to
Yeah.
stay the same when they're going my way, whatever it may be. Constant tanha all day long.
Yeah, and it reminds me also of what U Tejaniya would say, that when a meditator would come and report their contentment and satisfaction, fulfillment in the practice, and living a simple life, and he would just kind of shake his head, flip his hand, and say, "Conditions, conditions, all conditions." And
Hmm.
what conditions? I don't remember if he actually said this, but something that he said would spark me to think more about his teaching and what he was getting at was, okay, well, what conditions could change now that would affect your happiness? What if your awareness got less?
Hmm.
What if you had a great loss, material or personal loss? Or what if you had an injury to your body? Or just all these different scenarios that you can display, and realize that
Hmm.
whatever level of contentment you thought you were having in terms of the meditation was still, he was just getting at, keep working under these conditions, keep focusing on the conditional nature of your happiness. And
Hmm.
was really pretty hardcore with not wanting to let meditators or monastics off easy in
Hmm.
terms of what their attachments and their conditioned reality really were, and not stop them midway along that exploration of the journey.
Yeah, absolutely, Joe. And I've had students ask me, because I describe kind of the experience in the monastery, and to them it doesn't sound that great, and they say, "So why do you do it?" And
Hmm.
one of my responses to them over the years has been, because there's absolutely nothing in the monastery experience that is pleasurable to my dopamine receptors.
Hmm.
There's nothing. On Western retreats. My good friend, he's our cook, and the food is very nutritious, and,
Hmm.
and it's the highlight of the day.
Hmm.
But in the monastery, there's nothing to
Yeah.
look forward to when it
Right.
comes to the wanting mind. And
Right.
I remember, just it becomes comical. I say to students, it's like once you get to a certain point, and the mind is just watching itself, which is what an incredible gift that is.
Hmm.
It becomes somewhat humorous, if not very humorous. And I remember one time in that first visit to the monastery, in the 48-day or whatever it was period I was there, um, at lunch, I'm sitting there on the floor with the other monastics, and all of a sudden, a hand reaches down in front of me and puts a bowl of ice cream in front of me, and I couldn't believe it. And it was so delicious. But of course, from that day on, every time there was a
Mm,
movement of a body through the room, the mind
mm.
was thinking, "Oh, is it ice cream again?" And I kid you not, Joa, I never had ice cream again. Not
Yeah.
only on that visit, or on my other visit to the monastery. So yeah, exactly. And that's the big thing. If our happiness is dependent upon conditions, then that comes back to that teaching of the Dalai Lama that I first received. And it's not happiness.
Mm,
From the perspective of the Buddha, that happiness is always unconditional. And if it's based upon conditions, then it's pleasure. And there's nothing inherently wrong with pleasure until we attach to it and believe that it's happiness.
right. I have my own ice cream meditation Burma story. That the first time I no, it wasn't my first Goenka course. It was a later Goenka course. I was taking a course at Dhamajoti, the Goenka Center, and I
Mhm.
was the only Western male there. It was like me and like 100 Burmese men. And one
Mhm.
time in the dining hall, as I was finishing my meal, a server walked over and gave me, and only me, a cup of ice cream.
Oh,
And
wow.
I was like, is this like some weird, like sick test of like, what it's like to just kind of single someone out with something good? And I
Yeah.
felt so uncomfortable because I was also coming, I was very, I hadn't been in Myanmar that long. So I was really conditioned by Western styles of running monastery or running meditation centers and courses, and
Mm.
how and just all the stuff behind the scenes. And so I just felt, but then I knew enough about Burmese culture, and especially I'd been in Asia for some time, so I knew about Asian face and stuff. And I was just going through in my mind, like, should I refuse it? Because if I
Mhm.
decline it, then I'm kind of showing solidarity with other meditators and not just seeking my own pleasures. But then the people who gave this to me, that were doing it out of kindness, they'll feel it was a slap in the face. But then if I eat it and enjoy it, I'm like this, this privileged white person that is getting something no one else has, but it's not my fault because they just gave it to me, and I'm just kind of stuck in these insane mazes of thought. And then I start to look around in the dining hall where I am because my eyes have been downcast. I'm not looking at anyone,
Yeah.
and the faces around me are all glowing with happiness that I have ice cream. Like they're looking at me with expectation and
Yeah.
compassionate, warmth and generosity that like, oh, it's great. You get to have ice cream.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden it breaks through and I just realize there's nothing wrong with this. They're happy. And I ate the ice cream and I don't remember enjoying the ice cream. I remember enjoying the fact that someone had given me something nice and everyone around me was enjoying that I got to have it. And so it was this kind of distillation and understanding of Burmese culture and silence
Wow.
that always stayed with me and that made me realize the Western style of thinking I was approaching this,
Right.
when those dynamics, and this is something I get to when I talk to people about Burma, is that so often before you go into providing certain answers, the questions themselves have to be unpacked. The questions, and especially when you're looking at mindfulness and meditation and monasticism,
Mhm.
when you're coming from that field, the questions that are coming are coming from such a different place that they can't really be answered in that context. And that's what was happening to me in Burma, is the questions I was asking about a white Westerner being the one privileged to enjoy a certain ice cream that no one else had access to. That was the wrong question, because as soon as I understood the context and the culture and the generosity, I
Mhm.
realized that I was creating a dynamic that didn't exist for anyone else. And
Right.
that allowed me to let go of it. And that was kind of one more step along the way of my own Burmese journey. And that segues into the question I wanted to ask you as well,
Mm.
is the experience of being at the monastery. You've talked about it a little bit in terms of just the austere nature and the lack of comforts and the intensive atmosphere and such. But going a bit deeper into it, you're in a Burmese monastery, a mini city. This is
Mhm.
Mahasi-style. This is also a historic place of kind of the epicenter of the lay mindfulness movement in Burma in the post-war period under UNU. So it
Mhm.
also is a play. It's a meaningful place to a lot of Burmese culturally, religiously, traditionally, everything else. You're coming from just a completely different life story and trajectory and conditioning. And so, can you go a bit more into the detail of what it was like living day after day in a Burmese monastery in Burma?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly was a culture shock. I had traveled a lot in my life, but I'd never been to Myanmar, and I hadn't spent time in a Buddhist monastery. But what struck me the most was just kind of how you described, the ice cream experience, just the sympathetic joy and the contentment of everyone in the monastery, not just the practitioners, but I remember, every morning, um, lining up for breakfast and lunch, and I was, usually the last one to go in to the dining hall, and walking in there and seeing the group of maybe 10, 12 Burmese ladies who are in there, and they're cutting up the vegetables, preparing food for lunch, and just with the biggest smiles on their faces, just having the best time, all the stray cats hanging around for a little piece if they can get one, so things like that. Just the way I was treated was, with so much respect and kindness, and at the same time with uh, you know uh, inspiring firmness, that you're here to do the work, that the schedule isn't optional, and this isn't a hotel. We're here to get this work done.
Hmm.
For me, coming from my background in athletics, I really thrive on that,
Hmm.
and I thrived on it. Instead of having to be the leader, I could be led, because the
Hmm.
the, the work ethic there, of everyone, whether they're practitioners or not, but especially the practitioners, was impeccable.
Hmm.
And some examples that I bring up on retreat to bring light to, what is mindfulness, and it's not just something we do when we're seated cross-legged on the floor. uh, and what I mean by that is, when I would go into the dining hall, as I said, I'd be, usually the last one to go in, or one of the last. and you'd walk in and there'd be like 400 to 500 pairs of flip-flops perfectly
Mm,
aligned and in such an order that was it was just incredible, their attention to detail,
mhm,
recognizing that, our mindfulness practice doesn't take breaks. It doesn't
mhm,
just happen when we sit cross-legged.
mhm,
We don't live to practice meditation. We practice meditation to live more efficiently. So there were all those examples of, just pure unadulterated joy, and dedicated work ethic. And then, the experience of seeing, the young monastics just fresh in there, don't know how to put their robes on, can't really focus,
mhm.
and then all the way up, the age demographic to the elderly monks who, they're doing walking meditation a little bit more quickly because, of course, the slower you go, the more difficult it is to balance. And it was just very endearing and very inspiring to be around a community and to live in a community like that was based upon altruism
Mhm,
and based upon taking care of each other, taking care of oneself
mhm.
to be able to take care of each other. And it was just such a radical departure from the way that Western culture has evolved. Um, and for that, I'm, eternally grateful for those experiences.
Yeah, one of the things I would often remark on is that in the West, when you go to a meditation course as a server, you're cooking this is assuming those courses where there's not paid staff, but you're
Right.
as in the Goenka tradition, you're going to serve others and prepare food and clean and serve and everything. A 10-day course is just exhausting. I mean, you're preparing food for, usually an average course size of a big course would be 70 to 100 people.
Yeah.
Often it's more like 30 or 40, and it's an extreme amount of work. And then you look at Burma, and they have 500,000 monastics who
Yeah.
are prohibited by their Vinaya, the monastic discipline, from asking for food, preparing food, buying food, procuring food, growing food, preserving food, doing anything related whatsoever. They can only take what's offered to them.
Right.
And say what you will about all the other things involved in Myanmar and Burmese Buddhism, and we could definitely go. I'm saying this as a disclaimer because I don't want to romanticize things. I know that there's a tendency to do that, and
Mhm.
it's important to be able to speak clearly and honestly about these cultural differences, but leaving aside everything else about that one can speak on, that could be critical. Just the mere fact that you have 500,000 monastics who have these prohibitions, can't eat after noon,
Mhm.
and that up and down the country they're fed systematically on time in the proper way so that they have the ability to have their sustenance and continue with their day.
Mhm.
When you just contrast that with dedicated meditators in the West who are exhausted by the effort of serving a 10-day course, one
Mhm.
time or several times a year, it would just blow my mind, that level of dedication, to say nothing of how many people are waking up at 4 in the morning to go to their local their alms round.
Yeah. I mean, alluding to what you were saying, just the remarkable ability of what generosity, what Dana can do, being in Myanmar and seeing, from the ladies cutting the food up to, the food that is donated, and just the way that everyone takes care of one another, and how the monastics are really revered. When I describe the monastic experience in the monastery, I say to students, I'm like, you probably don't want to go there. You probably wouldn't want to become a monk or a nun,
Mhm,
would you? And they kind of like nod in affirmation. And but as I say to them, one thing that struck me when I got to Myanmar was like leaving the airport. I remember seeing like billboards with monks on it,
mhm,
and that likened me to like a memory of like landing in Los Angeles and driving out of LAX, and you've got billboards, but on the billboards there, it's like the movie stars. Whereas
mhm,
in Myanmar, this is considered a very auspicious opportunity to dedicate your life to walking this path, and those that don't have that opportunity, there's no jealousy or envy. It's sympathetic joy, and it's expressed through generosity and dana. And it's just, for me, it was very transformative to see a different way of life and what we have in terms of human potential when we live from our hearts, as opposed to when we're conditioned to live from this, mythology of separation that we have to look out for number one at all costs.
Right. So as you describe your experience in that Burmese monastery, and you describe the altruism and the different all the another thing actually that strikes me just now as I'm reflecting on what you said, you're also describing the opposite of a one size fits all model. I mean, just the example
Mm,
of the young novices and the older monks
mm,
and the different ways they have to navigate. And this was something that had a really profound impact on me as a meditator. The longer I spent in Burma was just realizing how much, when I started with the Goenka courses in the West, I really saw this as a kind of rarefied vehicle that everyone had to be able to contort themselves into to derive the benefit from, and that was really just what you had to do because this was a kind of perfect idealized messaging that you needed to modify yourself in order to be receptive to receive the deeper underlying messages of it, which in my case is
mm,
a side story. And I talk about this on another podcast with Jonathan Crowley. But myself being, and I was in Burma as an educator promoting student-centered classrooms. So to me, it was kind of this height of irony that I was everything about my profession was looking at how to make things more student-centered, and um, I was advocating spiritually fitting into a prime teacher centered and authority centered way to engage in the practice. But when I came to Burma, I was really confronted with all of these different ways and seeing that, okay, so you're introverted, you're extroverted, you're young, you're old, you're male, you're female, you're busy with family commitments or with work, or you have extra time, or you have a bit more money but no time, but maybe more time and not as much money, or you like this style of teaching or this style of study. And just seeing this such an extraordinary range of possibility for where you could fit in, what you could do. And then when I would look back on the Western model, and not just Goenka, but just the whole, what it was like trying to export an integrative teaching into the West and consolidate it into a retreat setting, and realize on one hand how valuable that was in disseminating something so precious where people walked away with a true internalized taste of it, which I would never minimize, and that there's so much value in
mm,
that. But then on the other hand, how there was just no substitute for being able to break down some of those artificial barriers that I think Western teachers and teachings and
mm.
platforms put on what you find in Myanmar, as well as that lack of an integrative approach where I think and this is not so much a criticism on the model they're presenting, because I don't know what the alternatives are, where there is some version of a one size fits all model that when you come to Burma, you get to see that whatever your size, metaphorically, whatever your size and your personality and predilections, there's a place for you to fit in to be able to benefit somewhere from these teachings.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree, and I think that comes back to what I was saying in terms of, my belief that we're not living to meditate, but meditating to
Mhm,
live more efficiently. And, whether in Myanmar it was the monastics who have had that, what is considered an auspicious opportunity, or those volunteering, working in the monastery, and then even outside of it, I just the
mhm,
fabric of the Dhamma through Burmese society really blew my mind. Just the compassion and literally the overwhelming like sadhus. When I remember
mhm.
when I got out of the monastery and I was in a taxi or whatever it may be, and the taxi driver would ask me, "What am I doing in Myanmar?" And I would explain, and
Yeah,
he literally stopped the taxi,
yeah,
and he just turned around with his hands together and he just sadhu, sadhu,
uh-huh,
sadhu, and it was incredible the way that the Dhamma is literally the bedrock, the
mhm,
foundation of the society, as opposed to, and it just is what it is. It's how conditions have evolved. Us now trying to kind of integrate it into our society, and it becomes more of a, maybe rigid approach that meditation is something we do, and I'm
yeah,
doing my meditation now, and then I have this other part of my life, and they're kind of different things. But as you said, there are so many different ways that the Dhamma expressed both through practice and towards others. And that's what I just found amazing, that I didn't feel there was anywhere in Burmese society
Hmm.
that it things shifted. It was just this like solid fabric that
Hmm.
was, I just felt, I felt so incredibly safe there. It was amazing.
Yeah, and I think that that's just another example that comes to mind is I'm more of an introverted person, and so
Hmm.
when I would see Western practitioners complain about a silent retreat and how they weren't able to talk to people, I took that as a character weakness. I just took that as
Hmm.
like, well, that's a defilement that you're constantly needing to chatter away, and this is a time to finally be within yourself. And as I partly because I was learning about learning styles through my profession, and partly from seeing Burma, I was just like, man, that's really such a a bullshit thing for me to say, in not being compassionate and understanding others, that and seeing and then looking at the example in Burma where like you could be so extroverted and so socially oriented, and this doesn't mean that you shouldn't take time with yourself, and that just because you have a strength in one area doesn't mean you shouldn't try to develop other parts of it,
Hmm.
but certainly you can play into your strengths. And it would, to tell an extroverted person the only real way to derive benefit is to shut off a natural personality trait of who you are and what you do. Like, okay,
Hmm.
maybe sometime that's valuable to do, but as a general practice, that's not really good advice and very helpful, very
Hmm.
skillful in recognizing and then seeing in Burma all these different ways that, all these different friends I had and people I saw that were so extroverted and so socially oriented and so, liking to be in a group and talking with people, but so oriented towards Buddhist practice and understanding. And I guess I want to follow that story up with just a question for you as well. You've touched on this before, but to ask it directly, many practitioners say that when they go to Burma, they learn as much from the community and the people and the culture as they do from the actual practice and technique and teacher. And so I wanted to ask, to what degree was that true for you, and what lessons did you take away from just the atmosphere there?
Yeah, I would agree wholeheartedly with that. That's kind of what I was just alluding to a few minutes ago, that,
Hmm.
it just felt to me that, it was an unbroken continuity of Dhamma throughout the culture. And it really kind of, um, well, it was, the first example where I had been shown uh, Dhamma as it is expressed in life outside of formal seated practice or formal
Hmm.
walking practice.
Hmm.
And I think that was, very inspiring to me, to see the ability to integrate, and not only the ability, the necessity to integrate the Dhamma into society. Because after all, if it's just within the realm of formal practice, is that going to create the change that we all want to see? And so it was very inspiring to me to see the different forms that practice can take within Burmese society on a daily basis, from the formal ones to the what we might call informal. But yeah, that it's just one and the same. That our practice isn't separate for our life from our life. That it's one and the same.
I mentioned how I would just receive this steady stream of questions from meditators that when they would come to Burma or write me. And one of those questions was, to what degree are Burmese people or Burmese monks, really meditating? And I would struggle with that question until I finally just said, okay, we have to unpack the problems with the question rather than just give you an answer. Because I
Mm.
understand where you're coming from. The meditation is, as you have said, meditation is something you do, and it's something that you do off and on. It's a practice. And but in Burma, it's like, as I started to integrate into life there and to see outside of formal practice, the chanting, the offerings, the metta, the alms rounds, both sides of the alms rounds, both walking on it as well as giving.
Mhm.
The So many different, even the dana ceremonies and the mental cultivation you have there. Even you don't do a dana, you don't give dana, but your friend gives dana. Your friend invites you. You say sadhu with a pure heart of happiness for the sympathetic joy that your friend is doing a good deed. All of these
Mhm.
different things I would have to unpack. This is not, and this would sometimes give ways to Western criticism of, this kind of Orientalist outlook of like, well, we've taken the pure practice and, we've refined it, and those people and those in Burma, they don't really practice as seriously as we have now cultivated it here. That that you look at a bit more deeply and say like, well, the way that you're judging and you're evaluating is really based on just a meditation centric, which is often very anti-intellectual
Hmm.
and uncomfortable with monastics for the religious clergy they might represent, or whatever else is going into it. And you're missing, you're taking meditation as a specific function and part of the day that you do, and you're not looking at the role that meditation is playing into mental cultivation. That's what it's
Hmm.
really doing. And that was part of my transformation. Or my first few years in Burma, I was working at the time, and I would take my vacations to go to monasteries to do self retreats, where I would be in complete silence and not have my eyes look up to see what was going on, and just, as I'd been trained, focus completely on the inner journey, which was wonderful. They were very powerful experiences. But over time, I started to realize I'm missing out on all of these lessons that being a part of this monastery would involve me to do. And I wasn't staying at like big Mahasi monasteries. I was staying in like caves or
Hmm.
monasteries of like, half a dozen people,
Hmm.
that were serving more rural communities. And so I changed my outlook to want to go back to monasteries where I was meditating for less hours, just a few hours a day. And I was trying to involve myself in Burmese, studying Burmese language and understanding monastic lay interactions and festivals and everything else. And not to say everything's rosy. I mean, certainly you learn a lot of the underside of Burmese Buddhist monastic culture. There's a lot there to talk on, but
Hmm.
I also learned, I learned things that I never could if I had just taken meditation as a singular activity.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one thing I noticed too in the monastery, that for those of us lay people that were there, that schedule we were attending to was rigorous and very disciplined. But at first I sometimes would see the monastics and I would think, well, they're not very disciplined,
Mhm,
and I soon realized that it was just like, well, yeah, but they're not on that same schedule every single day of their life in the monastery,
mhm,
They're formal periods of intense meditation, the rains retreats, etc. And then there was this camaraderie, this like this community feel and friendships. I was just like incredibly inspiring, and it wasn't constant, gazing at the floor, avoiding eye contact,
mhm,
etc. And yeah, that was just such a beautiful thing to see, because you could start to see how the practice uh, uh, manifests in human life, as
mhm,
opposed to just this idea that, as we've said, that meditation is separate. That, as I say to students sometimes when I give a talk, I'm like, a lot of people think of the Buddha as a spiritual teacher or maybe a god or both or whatever. But like the Buddha was advising, on politics to
yep,
kings. He was
mhm,
working on relationships
mhm,
with married couples. He was talking about environmental stewardship,
mhm,
and that ultimately, like you can't separate. You can't have the foundation of Dhamma not integrated into all aspects of your life, and you can't pick and choose. You can't chop it up. And once you're on that path, then it begins to inform every aspect of your day, from pouring your coffee to whatever it may be, shopping for groceries, and
mhm.
then including your formal sits.
Yeah, that's great. So then, looking at this experience that you had in Burma as a practitioner, you then moved on in your journey to becoming a teacher and staying on this Burma influence, and Mahasi influence, and Burmese culture and such. How did this experience in Burma, and I know you went back for another extended retreat, so you had more touches with the culture before everything went to hell with the coup
Hmm.
breaking out, and when foreigners were still able to go there and practice.
Hmm.
How did this experience, these extended interactions, play a role, not just impacting you as a practitioner, which we've been talking about in some detail, but starting to shape the way you look to formulate the teachings in another context as you moved into being a teacher?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, in terms of teaching, I was very fortunate. I mentioned this Buddhist hermitage close to Vancouver Island here, on a little island called Denman Island, and I was going there for years doing retreats. And one of the lamas, the Tibetan lamas there, when he heard we knew each other. He knew I taught yoga, etc. When he heard I was going to Burma, he asked me when I came back, would I be interested in teaching this Mahasi method, because his Rinpoche had spent time studying with Mahasi uh, many years prior, and so
Mm,
he had this very close connection to the Mahasi method.
mhm,
And so he asked me and he invited me to teach, and I remember thinking like, "Oof, that's like," I to me at that time I didn't think I would ever teach Buddhist meditation,
mhm,
because it was kind of like you're introduced, you're invited to do it,
mhm,
and it was just my practice. And then so I went to Burma, and that first time, and then came back and taught a retreat or two, and then went back again. And yeah, what I found was, and how I integrated it was, the intensive style and approach of the Mahasi method, when looked at as like a tool as opposed to a way that we're living. I sometimes have students ask
mhm,
me, they're like, "So, am I supposed to move this slowly when I
mhm,
leave retreat?" And I
mhm,
say, well, you'll likely move a little bit slower than you did before,
mhm.
but if you move as slowly as you did on retreat out in society, you might have the police come
Yeah,
talk to you and
right.
question what you're doing. But I found, integrating that very direct approach, and combining it with my past, both through sport and the integration of my university degree, and the study of primates, and bring a lot of the science of the animal brain into it. It became much more digestible for a lot of Western practitioners that came with me.
Mhm,
And then, it's not the 3 a.m. till 11 p.m. schedule. It's still an intense vipassana schedule for sure. And the practitioners work very hard. But I do, at the end of the day, we do a very gentle yoga practice, which just really helps. Even though, as you know, in the Mahasi method, there's walking meditation. It's still, even if you're sitting on a chair, it's still very, very taxing on the physical body for
mhm,
a Westerner who's never done this work before. So, I don't feel like I cut corners at all. I've actually began on retreats now. I don't even put the schedule out in front of their seat um, when they show up, because as soon as someone who hasn't been on a retreat sees that schedule, the wanting mind to leave
mm,
comes up pretty quickly. And I unlike the monastery, as I tell them, it's like this schedule is not mandatory.
mhm,
I'm not going to come to your room and ask you where you are,
mhm,
but there's also nothing on the schedule that is extra. And as I say to them, I'm not here to waste your time. I'm not here to waste my time.
mhm,
And as I said before a couple of times, I meditate to live more efficiently. And so using, a very focused schedule, with some understanding, that it's, as I say to people, like, if you're really serious about the path of vipassana or the teachings of the Buddha, you're not going to just do one retreat. So, also having that ability to listen to one's, inner compass, depending on what might be going on, and supporting each individual as needed. For everyone that comes is at a different place.
right. And you also mentioned how another thing that's gone into your methodology and approach as a teacher is your interest in science and your college degree in primatology. You said, "quote Buddhist meditation opposes the evolutionary survival template," end quote. And
Mhm.
so I'm wondering if you could also go into talking about how your interest in science and your college degree has also played a role in you understanding meditation and the Buddhist teachings, as well as how you present them in as a teacher.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a huge part of the way in which I share the Dhamma. And, to be honest, when I went to university, as I mentioned, I went on an athletic scholarship. Had I not been on an athletic scholarship, I probably wouldn't have gone to university at age 17, right out of high school.
Hmm.
So when I got there, I didn't know what I wanted to study. And for the first 2 years, I bounced around from faculty to faculty, not really finding anything that was really that interesting to me. And then finally, probably halfway through my second year, or maybe near the end, start of my third, my coach said to me, like, you have to declare a major.
Hmm.
And I took an anthropology 201, as it was at University of Calgary, the Intro to Anthro and Human Evolution
Hmm.
class, and it really sparked my interest. And at the University of Calgary, they have a primatology department, and which is a rather unique department, and obviously not all universities have it. And So I got into that, and to be honest, at the time, it was interesting to me. And I spent some time in the jungles of Belize conducting field research on wild monkeys, and studying human evolution and our primate ancestors to better understand why we behave the way we do. And it was fascinating. But to be quite honest, I it was a degree that allowed me to continue to play basketball, and I never
Mhm.
figured it would come into my life.
Mhm.
Or I wasn't, as my professor said, she's like, you don't make any money doing field research, so unless you're going to become a professor, there's not that many avenues for it.
Mhm.
And lo and behold, as I got into meditation, as I say to practitioners, the Buddha wasn't specifically, of course, he didn't have that terminology, but from what I can understand, he wasn't specifically talking about the paleo mammalian brain and the reptilian brainstem and the animal brain, the way we now can with neuroscience and science itself and this type of jargon and terminology. But everything that he was pointing to in terms of where suffering arises from, and why it's arising, is pointing to this animal part of our brain.
Mhm.
And I remember when I was younger and I was trying to heal my body, and I was doing it from a very aversive perspective, a lot of anger and self guilt, anger towards myself, anger towards coaches, etc. And I thought I was doing everything I could to heal,
Mhm.
but because it was coming from this place of dosa, of aversion, I wasn't healing. I was actually preventing healing from taking place. And at the time, I was studying yoga therapy, as I mentioned, and I came across a quote by an American psychiatrist, Carl Rogers. And the quote was, "The curious paradox is only when I accept myself exactly as I am can I then change." And
Mhm.
I was in a yoga
Mhm.
posture at the time, and I fell out of the yoga posture
Mhm.
crying on the floor, because I realized I didn't truly accept it. I intellectually, I said I accepted this,
Mhm.
but there was no loving kindness. There was no metta. There was
Mhm.
aversion towards it.
Mhm.
And so I bring that into play when, when I teach, and I, bring up the science of, our shared DNA with, chimpanzees, our closest cousin, 98, 0.2%, depending on the study. And for much of our history, humans have separated ourselves from the natural environment, and not, looked at ourselves as not being part of the animal kingdom, much to our dismay, and our suffering, and our self-destruction of both ourselves and the environment. And so when I bring in this stuff, and we talk about the science behind it, and then talk about the Dhamma and the mind, and
Mhm.
where literally, like the Vedana, the feeling tones of experience, coming from the limbic system, from the amygdala, and how we can, as practitioners now, not just through my degree, but through all the science out there, how we can now corroborate what the Buddha was teaching, through science. It's an incredibly, not only inspiring time for these practices, but I would say, a highly, probable time for awakening, in a way, with the science we have combined with the spiritual teachings. The only thing that's stopping us from awakening is not wanting to do it,
Mhm.
because it's work, but we
Mhm.
have so many resources, both intellectual and experiential through practice, at our fingertips, that it's an incredibly potent time, for awakening. And so I integrate a lot of that, and combine it with the Dhamma. And it's just something that's really flowed naturally, for my mind, just based on how it's been educated, both in university through my degree, and then through the intellectual study of the Dhamma and the experiential study of the Dhamma through practice.
That's great. That's beautiful. Thank you for that. Another big part of your journey, as well as your teaching, is yoga, and your courses integrate yoga with meditation practice. You've referenced how this allows the possibility of, quote, integrating vipassana within flow of postures, end quote. We This has been part of your journey from the start. I mean, we heard about it initially as you first practiced yoga when you were a basketball player, and then as you were
Mhm.
healing, and then you had a whole other part of your journey that we didn't really get into yet because we were focusing on the meditation part that coincided with Burma.
Mhm.
But this background into yoga teacher training and learning different forms of yoga, and then being a yoga teacher, and then being formulating yoga teaching with your Mahasi meditation style as well, or maybe the more pan Buddhist
Mhm.
practice that you're bringing, however you would describe it. But there's an integration.
Yeah, I mean, for me, when as I mentioned, when I came to yoga, it was as a form of therapy, and I couldn't even put my socks on, and I was in a lot of physical pain. And so for me, fortunately, I was starting at the same time to study Buddhist theory and mindfulness, and taking nothing away from the yoga tradition. In practices, more active, dynamic, like vinyasa posture practices. Uh, I couldn't just use conscious breathing to move through the challenges. And then I started to get into what's called yin yoga, a very passive practice where you're in postures for 4 or 5 minutes without moving, and very, very helpful for the connective tissue. But it was excruciating for me, and it was virtually impossible for my mind to stay in these experiences because they were so uncomfortable. And so I started using Buddhist mindfulness in my yoga practice, to support the development of my body. And then that kind of just naturally flowed. And I've spent a lot of time studying classical yogic philosophy, both here and in India, and I have a lot of respect for the tradition. But what really took me down the path of the teachings of the Buddha was because I could experience the teachings for myself. I felt with the yoga tradition, there was some things I could experience, and then there was a lot of things that I had to kind of take on blind faith. And I've always been a born skeptic. I wouldn't even necessarily call myself a Buddhist. I am an individual, a mind that finds great joy and curiosity in challenging perspectives and seeing for myself, what other human beings have perceived over the course of our history. And so for me, the Buddhist practices really became a refuge because I could really see the what was going on in my own mind based upon what the Buddha was talking about. And so then I just started, my whole practice became my yoga practice, that is, became integrated with Buddhist mindfulness, vipassana, if you will. And then as a result of that, because and hopefully this is for all teachers, we should be teaching from experience, not from the intellect or book knowledge. It was just natural that then I would teach yoga with these principles. And so I think it's really helpful. Students have said on retreat what they find really beneficial is it gives us, in our Vipassana retreat, when we come to yoga, it's not like all of a sudden the Dhamma stops and Vipassana ends, and then we do yoga, and then we go back into Vipassana. And so it's another example, just like eating, meditation, whatever it may be, putting your sandals or your shoes in order, that we transition into the yoga practice. And I integrate the exact same teachings that I've been talking about all retreat, and people can see how, wow, this vinyasa yoga class that I've only ever heard classical yogic philosophy integrated with it can also be integrated with vipassana. That, as I mentioned before, there is no way that we can really put a halt to the Dhamma, because it's everywhere. You see it everywhere. And so it's been a way in which practitioners on the retreats I offer can also develop a lot of insight into the teachings of the Buddha through the contemplation, especially of physical sensation and the concomitant feeling tones that arise from it in a yoga practice.
Mm, thank you for that. I think another hallmark of your teaching, as far as I've been able to glean from what you've shared online, is is this understanding that we're not meditating for ourselves alone, as well as the deeper implications and understanding of what meditation practice is. You have a short video on your Instagram which really moved me, the title of which, the "Our practice is not here to entertain."
Mhm.
And you go on to reference how different spiritual traditions from Asia have been exported to the West, but infer that the underlying purpose of the practice may have been modified by some teachers, and more of a source of pleasure or mundane balance than a very deep exploration of the mind body phenomenon, which, as we know, can be accompanied by very hard truths, a lot of pain, but suffering through understanding suffering with the intention of coming out of it. It brings one deeper into an acceptance of the existence of suffering, which is the essence really of the Buddhist teachings. And I think of
Hmm.
any kind of path of truth anywhere. This short video, it seemed to me to be both somewhat of a subtle criticism of some aspects of this growing mass mindful meditation movement we've seen in the West, along with this gentle encouragement to bring it back into proper focus with correct values, along with an exposition of your own belief and teachings in it. Can you unpack more the meaning you were intending in the message you were trying to impart here?
Yeah, certainly. And yeah, I think it was a criticism of the way, things have evolved in the West. I recently said to someone, uh, for me, as I just mentioned, the teachings of the Buddha have been the path that really resonate with me. But the yoga tradition, also has so much to offer people. But I feel like I shouldn't say we've missed the boat, because the boat is always there. We can always go back and get on it. But thus far in the West, the way that yoga has evolved, for example, it really has become a form of entertainment, and about creating, quote unquote, delicious, juicy, really comfortable, pleasurable experiences on the yoga mat. And there's absolutely nothing wrong with experiencing, pleasing sensations and feeling good on the yoga mat. But as I think it was Ajahn Chah said, as teachers, if we only give our students, whether it's yoga or meditation or otherwise, what they want, then we're actually doing them a disservice. And to have practices of yoga which are really have evolved to be about comfort and feeling good at all times, to use a Buddhist reference point, it's like we are just increasing the attachment to pleasant feeling tones, and as a result of that, increasing the attachment and in turn aversion to the unpleasant feeling tones. And sadly, if we don't focus on working with all types of postures, including the ones that are uncomfortable, we can avoid them in the interim, and maybe we feel like we're happy and we're really comfortable and healthy in the body. But then at a certain point, no matter how much yoga we do, if we're lucky enough to live to a ripe old age, there will be unpleasant feeling tones in this body. And if we haven't developed a way to relate to them with equanimity, then there's going to be suffering. There's going to be dukkha. And so, often the uncomfortable postures are avoided. And then as a result, over time, the range of motion is lost. And then the body becomes increasingly more uncomfortable. And I think Thich Nhat Hanh once said, the cure for the pain is in the pain.
Hmm.
And this isn't, to take an aggressive approach, but, wherever there's fire, wherever there's heat, whether it's in the physical body or the mind, that's where we have to put out the suffering or put out the discomfort. We have to go towards it,
Hmm.
as opposed to away. And so, and truly, what I find is that's what people really want from their practice, because that's what really allows them to live a more comfortable lifestyle, both physically and
Yeah.
mentally, by moving towards the discomfort, in a very intelligent and wise way. We're not here to injure the body. But if we constantly run away from all the postures and all the practices that are unpleasant
Hmm.
and go towards the pleasant, eventually, there will be viparinama dukkha. There will be the decay of the pleasant, no matter what. Eventually, that posture won't be comfortable at age 90, 95. And then if my happiness is dependent upon what I can do on a yoga mat because I do all the postures that feel good,
Hmm.
then what happens to my happiness when I'm aged or there's an injury and I can't do my favorite postures on the yoga mat? So I think that, yoga, like any of these traditions, has so much to offer, but we have to understand that, they're not designed to make us feel good. They're
Hmm.
also not designed to make us feel bad. That's
Hmm.
the duality that the mind gets stuck in.
Hmm.
And, when people come on Vipassana retreat, it's very interesting. And I share this with groups. It's like people show up and they're very happy to be there, or so they think. Expectations are high. They haven't seen the schedule yet. They haven't got
Hmm.
into the work. Then by day 2 or day 3, when they're starting to experience like what this is, they think something is wrong, that the practice isn't working.
Hmm.
But as the Buddha taught, that's when the practice is actually working. But we're
Hmm.
so conditioned to think that meditation and yoga is about rainbows and butterflies, which eventually it will be. But
Hmm.
to get to that point, we have to go through some hardship and some work to get there. And so, and then by the end of the retreat, the smiles are back. And this time, those smiles aren't based upon conditions;
Yeah.
they're based upon insight and wisdom. And that's the classic vipassana glow that we speak about. So, in a way, I feel like that's one reason that the teachings that I share via the wisdom of the Buddha, also from my background in sport, you don't become successful in sport by not working hard. And, an example I often use is like on the side of the basketball court, there used to be a plastic garbage pail, like a big plastic garbage pail. And I asked students, I was like, do you know what that was there for? And they don't know. And then I tell them, of course, that was for vomiting into from pushing yourself so hard. Now,
Hmm.
that's an extreme form,
Hmm.
but you don't get anywhere in life, whether it's a university degree or athletics or dancing or music or whatever it is,
Right.
without going against the grain of the preferences of the mind. And when we do that, that's where liberation starts to seep into the heart mind, and it's incredible to watch. It's tough the first couple of days of retreat. I got to tell you, Joa,
Hmm.
I have to pull out all the things from my athletic career to motivate and to inspire people to keep doing the work. But I give all my practitioners credit. They stick with it, and they begin to see and see clearly, and it's an amazing process to watch unfold.
That's great. And to put another characteristic on your teaching from what I've been able to glean, as well as personal interactions with you over the course of the past number of years, what I find especially really powerful about your teaching is the way that you've articulated this intersection between the inner spiritual journey and the necessity of social engagement and connection with others, which referenced on the introduction to this talk. In other
Mm-hmm.
words, it's not a practice that's just meant to be practiced in isolation and exclusion from the reality confronting us, even though it is an inner journey. And I want to quote something you've written on this topic. You wrote, quote, "It may be difficult at times to see how the minute changes in our own being will affect the future outcome, but when we become privy to the mechanisms of causality, there is no doubt in my mind that each and every moment that I am practicing, both on and off the mat, I am contributing to a social movement that one day will reap benefit to humankind and all living species. There's perhaps no greater time in history for the cultivation of an altruistic way of living, and I'm blessed to be given the chance to make a difference, beginning with my own heart," end quote. So this is a profound statement encouraging a trust in the process, along with a longer perspective of growth and one's place in a society of many different forces and actors. And I'm wondering if
Mm-hmm.
you could say more about this approach that you have and how you try to combine this outlook and understanding along with the internal understanding and acceptance of suffering.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, thank you, Joa. Yeah, as from what I've found experientially on my path, and as I say to students, I think the biggest hindrance to receiving the gifts that the Dhamma has to offer through meditation practice is when our practice is all about us. This is my practice. I'm doing this for me, because at the end of the day, the self, the construct of self, doesn't want to do what it doesn't want to do. It wants to do what's comfortable. And so it's very difficult, I think, to get somewhere on this path when everything is about this is my spiritual practice, my meditation practice. I'm doing this for me. And as I say to practitioners, when you start to dedicate the fruits of your actions to others and to society and to the future of our species and all living things with whom we share this planet, you will begin to see your practice and the results thereof expedite exponentially when we begin to break down kind of this sense of separation that I'm doing it just for me. And for me personally, uh, this is what I get the most joy out of. And when I look at the Dhamma, for me, what I saw in it and what inspired me so much to pursue it was not just that it was helping me heal. But I remember, when before I picked up, that first book by the Dalai Lama, I always felt very kind of lost in society, that, I didn't feel like I belonged here. Almost felt like alien, you
Hmm.
know. And then when I started reading teachings of the Buddha, my jaw dropped, you
Hmm.
know, and I was like, wow, there is this perspective out there that I've
Hmm.
kind of felt my whole life.
Hmm.
And I really, you know, and as I say to people, I don't think this is the only path that can do this. It's just the path that I know the most because I've spent the most time doing it. But to me, what motivates my practice every day is not to benefit me, but to benefit others and to do something that is bigger than just the individual self. And typically, the conditioned mind just takes a very myopic perspective that I'm doing meditation for myself, or if I'm doing it for other people, well, I'm not going to see these changes. Well, that may certainly be true. You know, as I say to students of mine, and I acknowledge to myself, I may not see drastic, palpable changes in the world in my lifespan, even if I'm given another 60, 70 years. But I'm practicing today to plant the seeds within me that then spread through a butterfly like effect to others for future generations. It's not just about this generation. You know, it's like the First Nation and the Aboriginal peoples of North America. That's the perspective they took. Their environmental stewardship was not just for their lifetime, but for future generations, both human and otherwise, animals, insects, plants, trees, etc. So for me, that's what motivates me the most. And you know, a quote I sometimes share with practitioners is, you know, because there's this kind of common thing. Well, what am I going to do? I'm not going to be able to make a difference. Well, if we begin to see that the manifestation of our society, the injustices, the environmental degradation, etc., is a manifestation of, you know, what are we now, 8 billion, you know, human minds living from this, you know, myopic perspective of being, you know, a separate self that gives rise to the defilements of loba, dosa, moha, greed, you know, aversion, delusion. When we begin to see that it's arising as a result of cause and effect, that
Hmm.
it didn't just happen
Hmm.
as a result of just a few bad apples, that this is part of our history, then we begin to intuit through the law of causality, through our practice, that okay, I might not be able to see palpable changes, but I know that if I plant the seeds here and you plant the seeds there and they plant the seeds there, that there is a chance in the future. And as a result of that, that radically motivates one's practice because we're doing it for others, because we don't feel so alone. And as a result of that, you know, the quote that I was just about to share, you know, Mother Teresa said something to the effects of, we can't all do great big things, but we
Hmm.
can all do small things with great love or
Yeah.
great
Yeah.
passion, you know,
Yeah.
and intention. And if every one of us, not even every one of us, I don't think it will ever be every one of us, but,
Mm-hmm.
you know, if even, you know, a percentage of humanity could really begin to plant these seeds and just reduce suffering on an individual level, of course, that is gradually over time going to reduce suffering on a global level, and begin to right the ship. If we have that chance, you know. But I'm going to go out, you know, Dhamma fighting. You know, I'm going to do everything I can in this life to live in line with the laws of nature in an altruistic way.
Mm-hmm.
And whether I see those changes or not, that doesn't matter, because not seeing those changes palpably still motivates me just as much as seeing the changes in the people around me, in the Dhammic communities, the Sangha, you know? So,
And that makes me think also of Burma, where contrasting with the West, where meditation can sometimes be seen as a selfish activity or an activity against the flow of conventional society, even a reaction of it. Less so now. With
mm,
it was much more on the fringe before, but certainly to some extent. Whereas in Burma, if you, I mean, referencing back to the taxi driver stopping and bowing
mhm,
to you and saying sadhu, he has a natural wellspring of sympathetic joy that you are directing your human life towards this noble endeavor. And if
mhm,
someone wants to be a monk in Burma, especially as a foreigner, the joy with which you'll be received. I mean, I can't tell you how many monasteries I'd go to in Burma where I'd ask if I can stay a couple days or a week to practice. And
mhm,
when they found out what my volition was and what my purpose, they would say with no sense of irony or joke, you could stay here for life. We'll build this building for you. We'll give you this. You'll have this bathroom, and this will be yours for life if you want it.
mhm,
There's so much joy in that. And if someone were to have a spiritual attainment, there's no sense I have ever seen of any kind of jealousy or your
Hmm.
attainment versus mine. This would be would rarely be understood. It's more of like an achievement on the part of humankind for
Hmm.
being able to do something that being able to have a purification which is going to benefit and inspire all of us. And this comes back to something else you've stated.
Hmm.
You have a very powerful quote, I would say bold, even controversial to some. When we meditate for ourselves, it doesn't work. I wonder if you can articulate first the danger that you've seen in the West, where some practitioners might feel their practice must be a self-involved endeavor. I mean, really, that's what it sounds like. That quote is a reaction to what how you're seeing some practice develop in the West, both in terms of practitioners as well as possibly organizations and teachers that are promoting that intentionally or unintentionally. And then how you've tried to respond to that danger by bringing a teaching which still focuses on the inner growth and still focuses on the need to personally confront one's own suffering and take that agency and responsibility, but while not doing so exclusively and blindly to that reality outside.
Hmm. Yeah, good question. You know, my take on that is not necessarily that we're not practicing for self, but what I mean by that is when the self is practicing, when wit is practicing, and I'm very identified with me and this persona of me, then with that, what I've typically found in my own experience comes too much effort, too much willpower being used to try to get it right, to achieve, to try to force results, because our sense of self has been so conditioned, especially in Western society, to go, 100%, or, in sports, we used to be told, like, give it 150%, like that's even possible. And so when the self is meditating, as
Mhm.
opposed to, you know, like not self, just the awareness and the heart, that's meditating, it gives rise to, all the baggage and the accoutrements of the self come with it. The willpower that tries too hard. Then when that doesn't work, because that doesn't work, then comes the unworthiness, the self-defeating beliefs, etc. And so, of course, to move beyond that part of the brain that's meditating, we can't use willpower to not meditate from the self. And so, by developing these practices such as metta, pradana, mudita, karuna, the Brahma Viharas, and really focusing on serving others from our heart, then that construct, that mythology of separation begins to break down. And that's where the meditation practice really begins to flourish, because as long as it's me that's meditating, I bring along with me just a load of baggage, of insecurities, of self-defeating beliefs, of willpower, trying to get it right, frustration, and the whole gamut of defilements and suffering. And when we can begin to really devote our time to, some of these practices that are really focusing outwardly as much as inwardly, which is really all of them, then what I found personally in my own experience and through practitioners' experience, that's when the practice really begins to take root and really begins to flourish. And in a way, I think it takes a lot of the burden off the shoulders of the self. That when we can begin to focus on others first, then everything kind of, then literally the parasympathetic nervous system has a chance to be induced and come online, and from that relaxation response, that's where mindfulness comes from. And as a result of that, this becomes, you were saying it can sometimes be looked at as this is a selfish practice, but I would state the contrary. It is the antithesis of a selfish path. And it's possible to do things, including meditation, from a selfish perspective. The ego instinct has many, many strategies as to how to make anything about itself, including spirituality. But just because the mind is being trained doesn't make it a selfish endeavor. And what we begin to see in this process is, as I've spoken about on retreat, I think when we think about selfishness in the world, because the conditioned mind is dualistic, it always goes to the extremes, and we think of, like, the the extreme examples of selfishness that is destroying the world. And yeah, that's certainly not helping. But it's also the little things on a daily basis, when the mind, is conditioned to really be focused upon itself, it's not altruistic, and it doesn't have this expansive awareness, this breadth of awareness that is mindfulness, then it begins to do things that it might not think is selfish. But when you multiply that by 8 billion people across the world, this is what is breaking down our united way of being a human family. And examples I give is, holding doors open for people,
Hmm.
or I see now on, like, subways and trams in Europe, and even buses here in Canada, where there's signs that say, to give up these front seats to, elderly people, people with a walker, women who are pregnant, whatever it may be. And to me, I look at that and I almost find that a little bit disheartening, that
Hmm.
we're at this point that we need signs to tell us
Hmm.
that when someone comes on that, elderly, or, maybe it's a young person on crutches, that if I'm sitting here, I'm going to stand up because I'm able bodied. And so it's these little kind of what might seem like trivial or not even selfish acts throughout the day that really are coming from a very myopic perspective of
Hmm.
me, my life, and myself,
Hmm.
that is beginning to create more and more divisiveness and separation between humans across the planet. And in turn, that gives rise to conflict, and in turn, suffering. So I would state it's the opposite. And what we begin to see, especially once insight begins to dawn on the construct of self and it begins to fall away, that we can absolutely dedicate our time to training the heart mind. And it's not a selfish act. It's coming from an altruistic perspective, that through this work that I'm doing, I can now go out and I can, that barrier of separation that gives rise to my fears and in turn my aversion to others begins to gradually and systematically break down. And that's how we begin to heal this society, one loving relationship at a time.
That's so profound, and it's so beautiful to hear your passion and eloquence in describing it. And it having as myself as someone who was trained in a model of meditation in among Western communities, but then went to live in Myanmar for 15 years and was around those communities and really being a bridge, functioning somewhere as a bridge between the two, and some comfort level and familiarity with both. One of the things I've come to see in being in Burma and having more contact with Western meditators is just, I don't know how to say this in a way that doesn't sound as biting as it is, but it's also true that I kind of can't believe the selfishness of how many Western meditators I've come across since. And this is, I don't want to say that in a blanket statement, and this is how they all are. And there's like so many beautiful examples, yourself included, of those that really don't fit that model. But it's also unfortunate how many have, and how many in interactions I've had have come with a sense of my practice and my insights and my needs for a retreat and what I'm looking at for spiritual and personal
Hmm.
growth and everything else. And so, and it becomes the my, me, my, mine, mine. And even
Hmm.
though those me's are focused on spiritual transcendence, and in some cases, even monastics. I mean, I remember I had a friend who was from Europe, and he became a monk in Burma and a monk for life. So he was very dedicated. And he just flatly said to me one time, like, do you know what I gave up in Europe for this experience? Like, do you know how much I had to give? Unlike some of the monks that are here in
Mm.
Burma, like, because of how much I gave up, like, there are certain expectations of the kind of monastery and spiritual life I want to have here that are just a standard that I have to, that I won't accept anything less than. And
Right.
he wasn't, the funny thing was, he wasn't talking about like, I want European foods, or I want, access to this or that. He was actually very austere and very, and didn't have a lot of those materialistic needs, but he was talking about those kind of humble monastic settings, which were not easy to find in Burma, and exactly what he was looking for, but which he had a sense of entitlement that was coming from just a me, mine, and also a reaction to, I think, among some self-described very serious meditators or Buddhists or monastics, that
Hmm.
that this so-called engaged Buddhism and social engagement and other things, that this is really this is actually a sign of immaturity in one's spiritual growth and not understanding karma for what it is, and not
Mhm.
and believing that we still have some kind of agency to shape the world, and this is, that this needs to be turned away from. And as with everything, there's grains of truth in all of this, that meditation does teach you, deep meditation does teach you a bit more about control of the environment and the role of karma and everything else. But this I would say is an extrapolation and going too far. And because of
Mhm.
that, I think this is bringing us now to this convergence of Western meditation students and teachers whose spiritual growth and training has been derived from Buddhist teachers or methodologies or lineages, and then this terrible crisis in Burma erupting. And how do you respond, if at all, to what's going on? And I think, and again, this is interesting for me because I'm in a convergence of communities. I'm in a convergence of activists and pro democracy actors and government officials and others that are resisting the coup in one form or another, and those in the monastic meditative environment that are coming more from the spiritual angle. And as anyone who listens to this platform know, we have a lot of conversations with a lot of those different kinds of people that usually platforms don't open quite to the extent that I think that we do in both of those crowds. And I've
Mhm.
gotten feedback from both sides. It's been interesting, from listeners, and some of the feedback I've gotten from more of the pro democracy people is it's been very interesting. And they've said, one of the things I like about hearing these conversations about spirituality and meditators is that one person wrote to me, I really saw meditators as this very selfish crowd, and this crowd that
Mhm.
was really just concerned with their own meditation progress at the expense of everything happening around them. And
Mhm.
the lack of response from Dhamma communities in the West to what was happening in Myanmar really confirmed those biases and those opinions. And the kinds of guests that we have on, like yourself, are often bridging those worlds to some extent, and speaking about the power of meditation in social context and such. And so this was opening him up to these wider truths of how breaking these stereotypes he had of meditators, especially Western meditators, especially in Myanmar, being
Mhm.
essentially kind of selfish beings. I mean, that's unfortunately a reputation that many have, and it's not totally unfounded, unfortunately, as well.
Mhm.
Even though, of course, it is generalized. There are people who break that stereotype, but but this brings us to this present day, where there are so many meditation teachers, practitioners, organizations that have built up their spiritual resume, sometimes in a pretty public way, of which great masters in Burma they trained under and learned from and everything else, and using this as kind of their spiritual homeland, and sometimes speaking about the gratitude we need to have, sometimes a bit of Orientalism mixed in there, and saying like, well, they're the source, but we really made it better, and we took it
Mhm.
and kind of made it our own. And this which is an attitude you find going back hundreds of years in different forms. But um but the extent to which the meditator community, the Buddhist, whatever you want to call it, mindful community, has has played any kind of role to step up in what's happening in Myanmar has been minimal. And again, I
Mhm.
say that without wanting to make any generalizations. I've said before, and I'll say it here, that what we're able to do as a platform, both as a nonprofit mission that engages in humanitarian missions in Burma, as well as the interviews we have, so much of it is supported financially by meditators, individual meditators who have seen what we're doing and have given. And so I really want to speak to the gratitude of those that have contributed, whether a few dollars or whether a few hours as a volunteer or whatever else. But we would also be remiss to pretend that the wider community has done next to nothing and has been almost completely silent. And I don't know why that is. And this is an interesting convergence, because you're talking about meditation as being something that is greater than ourselves, and the sense of connectedness. And you personally as well, I have to publicly pat your back and compliment you that you have consistently donated a percentage of your teachings, partly to the Mahasi Center and partly to Better Burma, and have continued in your teachings and on your social media and to your students to remind them about what's happening in Myanmar and our connectedness to that as practitioners, which and you have stepped up in a way above and beyond to the extent and consistency that you have done, that has really stood out in a remarkable way and a very moving way. And so I'm bringing all this together with the question of both looking at why you have decided to do what you've done with the level of support you've had, both material as well as how you've shared and spoken, and then contrasting that with what it means, what your feeling is with what you've seen of the wider response of the mindfulness community. I've shared my opinions. I don't want to assume those on you. On you, you might have other ways of looking at it, but just as you've looked at the mindfulness, meditation, Buddhist, whatever you want to call it, Western pockets of communities and the way that they've responded or not responded, what have you seen in that, and what do you think the reasons for that are?
Hmm. Well, firstly, thank you for the kind comments, and I have to turn that appreciation and gratitude in large part to the community of practitioners that I've worked with over the past 7 years, ever since that Tibetan Lama invited me to teach. At that time, he asked me, do you want to teach by dana or do you want to charge for it? And it was an easy decision for me because I had always received the teachings by dana. And then from that time, 2015 on, I won't say it wasn't scary at times to try to build a teaching career on that model, but the response of people, both to support me as a teacher and in turn to support the monastics in Myanmar and as well your non-for-profit Better Burma and the lay people of Burma, has been incredible. And for me personally, I never expected to be teaching. It was not something that I was planning to do. As I think I mentioned, I was petrified of public speaking. um, I feel incredibly humbled to be spending my life, at least now, for the time being, sharing the Dhamma, to have been invited to teach in this tradition, to have been invited to go to Myanmar, to have been received the way I was there. I'm still very close with the president of the Mahasi monastery over there and his nephew, who is educated in the US. Very close with him. Uh, so, this is really not about me. This is about us. We rise and fall together. And for me, inviting practitioners, if they feel the call to offer dana to Myanmar as well, is it's not even a question. I don't think in my heart, and I'm not trying to promote myself as being anything special, but I think anyone who walks the path long enough, that innate altruism of our heart begins to bubble up, and once it does, you can't push it away. And I think one of the misconceptions maybe about mindfulness is that it's this form of like concentration, maybe likened to absorption concentration, where it's a narrowing of the breadth of attention. But truly, mindfulness is this expansive awareness and expanding of the breadth of attention. And, I love the way that it's sometimes put with the metta practice that, no thing, nothing, and nobody left out of our hearts. And so it's just a natural process and unfolding of the law of causality when the defilements are eradicated through insight and practice, that how could we not give to others, especially to those in a country where this method, these teachings came from. And I think for me too, spending a lot of time in the yoga industry and seeing how yoga has come from ancient India, and it's really lost, and not completely, this is a generalization, um, but lost much of its connection to India and to the source of where this wisdom is coming from. And so the same goes for me with the teachings of the Buddha, that um, we must honor these places from which the wisdom arose. And what I've found is that practitioners, they really want that opportunity as well. And with regard to the discussion, the topic of, the self and the selfishness that can arise, in mindfulness communities, I think, as I mentioned before, the ego instinct, the self, can take anything and make it about itself. And I truly believe that, underneath that construct, we are all extremely altruistic beings. We are highly generous and loving. And sadly, at this point in time, especially in Western contemporary culture, we don't have so many avenues through which those innate qualities of the heart are able to be expressed. And so it can be, it can be maybe kind of difficult. When people go on a retreat, they feel that way, but then, they leave retreat and they go back out into this system that is like, like a vortex of individuality and selfishness and looking out for number one. And, through no fault of their own, this is unconscious behavior. But when that mind goes back into its conditioned myopic perspective, it doesn't think about Burma. It doesn't think about what's going on in other places of the world, and not just, other places, even on the streets of our own cities, the homeless. One teaching I often give my students is, obviously with discernment. If an individual, may be under the influence of something, you have to be mindful. But when you can tell that a person living on the street is in a sober state, we've all done it before, walked by and tried not to look at them, even though our heart knows that they're there, to stop and talk to those people. And so the collection of Dana for Myanmar is just, I think, something that it's hugely important for my own spiritual practice. And from what I've heard from practitioners, it's very important to them that we're helping out a place that has given us so much through these practices and through these teachings.
Well, I thank you for that. I mean, I thank you, just individual to individual, also just as someone who deeply cares about Burma, is invested in the work that we're doing, that
Hmm.
this generosity and this compassionate spirit has been something that has framed your outlook and your teaching and what you're trying to pass on. And it's such an inspiration hearing your passion and eloquence and how you're bringing this to students, and your understanding of what mindfulness can do when it really does take on these wider forms, and breaking down the ego and breaking down what this eye structure is, and where it can, the purification of certain defilements, where that that purity of mind and goodwill can extend beyond the practitioner into that wider community. So that's just, I just, I can't express my appreciation enough for that.
Well, Joa, thank you, man. I mean, for providing the medium through which we can help as well. We're, as I said, we rise and fall together. We're all in
Mm,
this together, and to have a community that has responded like this, and to have a medium like the one that you've provided, through which we can help in different ways, not just sending sponsored meals to the monastery, to the Mahasi monastery. It's incredible, and it's just it's so important to me. In I haven't spent a huge amount of time in Myanmar. I hope one day we can all go back,
mhm,
but it's given me so much, and I've got very deep relationships with the people that I met there still. And
mhm,
one of my friends, the nephew of the president, a couple of years ago at the start of the coup, he was posting some things on his social media just about organizing peaceful rallies, and we used to talk quite regularly. And then after a while, it kind of went silent, and I didn't really want to think what I thought might have happened
mhm,
was happening. And then, yeah, it was in February of this year. I was back here on Vancouver Island leading retreats, and I got a response from him, a message after maybe a year and a half
mhm,
of not hearing anything from
mhm,
him. And I kid you not, the first thing he says to me, he says, "Whit, I'm so sorry I didn't respond
mhm,
earlier."
mhm.
And then, of course, where he was in the past year and a half was imprisoned
Oh
by the
man.
Tatmadaw,
Oh
and
God.
he escaped with his life. But that's the type of
Yeah.
heart that is the fabric of Myanmar. And
Mhm,
it's just such a special place, a place that for most Westerners, even aside from the coup, they couldn't pinpointed on a map, or they
Yeah.
haven't heard about it. Maybe the change from Burma to Myanmar name doesn't help understanding,
Mm,
but bringing awareness to all that stuff, and how good it feels to give to others, and if we can make our life about that, and especially our practice will flow with ease, and we will truly experience that unconditional happiness when we put others ahead of ourselves. But that's going up not only going upstream, that's going upstream of a raging river with the
mm.
snowpack melting, because our system is not built that way. And as such, that just inspires me to continue to do it. There's still so much work to be done, and we can't let our foot off the gas. We got to keep going. And as I said, whether we see palpable change in our lifetime or not, none of us are guaranteed tomorrow. So
Yeah.
we don't know when will be our last day, but let's live today, and do everything we can to create a harmonious altruistic environment for all living things, because that's where our happiness comes from. We can see that our society is not happy, and of course it's not. It doesn't. Happiness doesn't arise when it's based upon the self. So yeah, thank you for creating the medium, and again, I just have to give a shout out and huge thanks, and a bow of gratitude to all the practitioners, both
Mm,
from retreats and my
yeah.
online programs by donation, that have supported. It's really incredible what they've been able to provide to Myanmar, and also to support my way of life, and teaching from this model that is so dear to me.
Thank you for that. I want to second the shout out that you give and express my own deep appreciation to any of your students who are listening that have answered your call to give support that has found its way to Burma, even though we don't know each other. And
Hmm.
they don't know exactly where their fund is going, the trust they have in you and the practice and in the vehicle for that represents our nonprofit. I just want to thank all of those so much heartfelt. And I also want to we did one very interesting show that I just want to point out for those potential donors or past donors. It's episode number 172, Hope from the Heartland. And what was so unique about this episode was that one American listener decided that he was so moved by a Burmese speaker named Theory that he started giving donations to our nonprofit earmarked towards supporting her because he just had so much trust and faith and integrity and in the way she had represented herself. And this has gone on for years, where she has received
Mm.
steady donations from him. And she eventually came to me and said, they've never met each other, never talked. I would like to come on the podcast and have a public conversation with him where we just talk about this act of giving. And it's just this beautiful conversation where she's saying, the material donation, of course it helps, but what's really amazing is we don't feel alone. Like, we know that
Mm.
someone is there supporting us, and his name is Jake. And she described how she would just tell her friends who would feel so disheartened and hopeless at times, my friend Jake still cares about us. My friend Jake gave this, and my friend Jake is supporting with this. And everyone around started building this kind of saintly image of this American named Jake, who was just, for no reason at all, had just decided to emerge and to make a difference. And Jake went on very powerfully to tell his story of being a heroin addict that had hit rock bottom, and coming his own part of his own recovery was in being sober. I think it's 7 years now, is being is showing up for other people. And so and the reason why I point to this episode as being something so profound is that often one gives money and you don't really know the financial transfers and mechanisms of where that goes and what that really does. And this conversation is so beautiful because it really puts a human heart on that act of giving above and
Mm.
beyond the material side of it. And really, from donor to recipient, you're hearing their own words and describing what this connection means. And it's at the end of the day, it's a human connection, and it's a human connection when this country and people are at their lowest of lows. This is for a country that's had a tumultuous history, and really terrible things
Mm.
happen, and for generations this is the worst it's ever been in anyone's collective memory. And the
Mm.
world has all but turned away, and
Mhm.
meditators and practitioners, for the most part, have also turned away somewhat as well. And so those moments where those people have stepped up, even in a small way, to just material or non-material, to know that someone somewhere cares and we're not alone, that is the thing that can give the fuel to go on another day and keep trying to resist a tyrannical military, make these sacrifices, work for democracy and human rights and freedoms, and try to transform their country into back to being a reciprocal of the Dhamma that can
Hmm.
continue to export it and welcome practitioners for monasticism or pilgrimages or extended retreats or socially engaged Buddhist monasteries with social missions, whatever it is. But these stories are just so powerful to know that what showing up can mean, what the smallest of things can mean for those that
Hmm.
are on the ground, and what it does to them through their own words, through theory talking. So it's really beautiful. And but with that, I just want to underscore again all of those who have supported our nonprofit by any means at any time, but
Hmm.
especially your students who have continued over months and years to be able to answer your call, and you for framing that messaging that like Jake, they might be an anonymous donor, but as you hear the words of theory, it's anything but anonymous. The people that are getting that
Hmm.
support are getting something they never would have expected when they're at their worst moment. And that's just to speak on all of their behalf, just a kind of a thank you and gratitude that no words can really express at the end.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. And as I say to students when I give the talk on dana before they've practiced dana, I just tell them, you have no idea how far your generosity goes, and like the appreciation that you've shared with me, the emails I get from the monastery, how grateful they are for the support,
Mm-hmm.
it is, it's helping people, as you said, not just, the financial help, but, that they know that we're here. And my friend, the president's nephew, in that message, after he apologized for not getting back to me, he's just the sweetest guy.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of that conversation, after a year and a half hiatus, he said, "Please, Whit, don't let them forget about us."
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so, that's the most important thing. And when we put that as our MO for our practice will flourish, and it will make change in the world. We, all of us, have such an incredible potential, to be compassionate, loving, altruistic. We all have it. I truly don't believe that there's any human being that doesn't have it. And it's just amazing that we have these gifts of Dhamma to be able to help us reveal that. And it takes work and it takes patient endurance, as the Buddha taught, but it's there. And once we reveal that potential that we all have, we have an incredible opportunity to create the change that we seek. And if it's not palpable in our lifetime, we know that we've planted the seeds and we've done what we can. So I just encourage everyone, to keep putting, one step in front of the other, patient endurance, keep walking the walk, because there's a lot of talking the talk
Mm-hmm.
in this day and age when it comes to spiritual practices. But thank you to everyone who shows up and does the work, including yourself, Joe. So thanks so much, man, for having me. I really appreciate it, man. You got a fast car, I got a plan to get us out of here. Been working at a convenience store, managed to save just a little bit of money. Won't have to drive too far, just cross the border and into the city. You and I can both get jobs, finally see what it means to be living.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. As regular listeners are aware, we often remind our audience about our nonprofit mission, Better Burma, at the end of a show. Truth be told, fundraising is hard work, and I can personally attest to the fact that it's really no fun to keep asking for contributions. Yet, the situation on the ground now in Myanmar is so distressing that we continue to do so on behalf of the Burmese people. What is most helpful at this time are recurring donations, which help alleviate both the stress and time involved in fundraising. If you are able to pledge a certain amount per month, our team can plan around having at least a consistent minimum amount to work within each month. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.
I quit school, that's what I did.
Oba yarananda dayananga yaranaya dayanam boda yaranam